Does that look better, Joe?
Can you frame the screen just a hair more in your shot? Okay, you only have just one more change.
Hi, Brian. Pretty pumped up today?
Initially the start of blog content too. Minus the camera.
Ashley, for your listening pleasure, we're going to put on some music.
so helpless inside. Oh love, there's no need to hide. Just let me love you when your heart is tired. Cold hands, red eyes, packed two bags at midnight. They've been there for weeks. You don't know what goodbye means. Just roll up a cigarette. Just forget about this mess. I'm waiting on the sidelines, from the sidelines. I see those tears in your eyes, and I feel so helpless inside. Oh, love, there's no need to hide. Just let me love you when your heart is tired. If your ghost pulls you apart, and it feels like you've lost who you are, my love, there's no need to hide. Just let me love you when your heart is tired. I'm alright, but I see through your white lies. These walls don't talk, and if they could, they'd say, can't hide your secrets, you can't forget about this mess. I'm waiting on the sidelines, from the sidelines. I see those tears in your eyes, and I feel so helpless inside. Oh love, there's no need to hide. Just let me love you when your heart is tired. If your ghost pulls you apart, and it feels like you've lost who you are, my love, there's no need to hide. Just let me love you when your heart is tired. She woke up in the morning with the sunrise in her eyes, but all that she sees is darkness. She won't tell you why. No more butterflies, 'cause they don't ever last. Stolen from the light by demons of the past. It's always raining. She keeps on praying. Sunny days lift me when I'm down. Sunny days breaking through the clouds. needs a shelter, shelter for the night. This one could be heaven, but she's looking down the line. No more butterflies, 'cause they don't ever last. Stolen from the light by demons of the past. It's always raining, she keeps on praying. Sunny days lift me when I'm down. Sunny days breaking through the clouds. Sunny days. She keeps on praying. She keeps on praying. She keeps on praying. Sunny days lift me when I'm down. Sunny days.
Think about love, think about hate, think about getting thin, why I'm always late. Think about tonight and what I'm gonna do, but I just can't concentrate 'cause I'm thinking about you. Think about money, think what I owe. Spent it on a car with a cool stereo, and I'm sitting in traffic, wishing it would move. Should be thinking about a job, but I'm thinking about you.
Thinking about you. Thinking about you now. Think about your touch. Think about your kiss.
Feeling like a kid again, total lots of bliss. Total lots of bliss. Think about my holidays, think golden rays, think about dancing and sitting in the waves. Then I'm thinking about a time and a place where we met, swimming in a sea and your hair was all wet. Think about colors, think about sex, think about your body, how it moved in that dress. Think about your touch, think about your kiss. Feeling like a kid again, total lots of bliss. Total lots of bliss. Total lots of bliss. Total lots of bliss. Total lots of bliss.
Thinking about you. Thinking about you now. Thinking about you. Thinking about you now. Thinking about you. Thinking about you now.
Think about your touch, think about your kiss. Feeling like a kid again, total lots of bliss.
Thinking about you. right now. Right now is the right time for the good things in life. Let's celebrate. Let's bring upon the better times and let the sadder time dissipate. Oh, I feel like a champion in the stadium. There's love and pandemonium. I'ma put this in my memory as the best time ever.
This is the best one yet, and I'm so happy. How could we ever forget? This is the best one. This is the best one. This is the best one yet, and I'm so happy. How could we ever forget? This is the best one. This is the best one. This is the best one yet.
Let's celebrate. Let's celebrate. Let's celebrate. Let's celebrate. Let's celebrate. Let's do it right now and not hesitate. We gonna rock it to the top like elevate. Bottoms up, here we go, let's intoxicate. I was feeling good, but now I'm feeling great. Best ever, and you know I don't exaggerate. This moment is a moment I'll appreciate. Today is a day I will remember.
This is the best one yet, and I'm so happy. How could we ever forget? This is the best one. This is the best one. This is the best one yet, and I'm so happy. How could we ever forget? This is the best one. This is the best one. This is the best one yet.
Let's celebrate. Let's celebrate. Let's celebrate. Let's celebrate.
This is your moment, this is your moment. This is the time, this is the time to get it right tonight, to get it right.
You don't wanna let the moment pass you by, so come on and save this one in a photograph.
Everything that made us cry and made us laugh.
The night's young and we raise our glass. We'll make it count like the best one we ever had. The best one yet, 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 the best one yet. This is the best one yet, 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 the best one yet. This is the best one yet. Oh, we are.
This is the best one yet, and I'm so happy. How could we ever forget? This is the best one. This is the best one. This is the best one yet, and I'm so happy. How could we ever forget? This is the best one. This is the best one, yeah.
Let's celebrate. Let's celebrate. Let's celebrate. Let's celebrate.
I'd walk with the lions, I'd swim with the sharks, and I'd go through fire and run through the dark. I'd cross the oceans and I'd walk for miles, be wild in devotion, nothing that I wouldn't do. We'll play with the tigers and we'll dance in the dark, and we'll fight fire till we see the stars. I cross the oceans and I'd walk for miles, be wild in devotion, nothing that I wouldn't do. Take my hand and be wild with me, be wild with me. You and I could be running free. Take my hand and be wild with me, be wild with me, yeah. 'Cause I've got the heart of a lion, so be wild with me. 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 So be wild with me.
Rise and shine, little darling. The bank has yet to close. The chassis giving your bedroom eyes, and I gotta say no, no, no.
Oh, come on and lay down here in the fire. Though we would know diamonds are gold. Hey, was it all for nothing? Tears they may fall on the pillow. Now that's gotta be worth something. Lay your head in mine. Oh, come on, stay the night if you like. And why don't we turn back time for tonight? Oh, come on and lay down here in the fire for a one more and why don't we last night for goodbyes?
You're like a part of me that only I can see. You're even with me when I'm all alone. The people stop and stare. They say that no one's there. Maybe we're better when we're on our own. 'Cause they don't know you like I know you. I know they don't. No, they don't. They won't love you like I love you. I know they won't. No, they won't. I'll take you anywhere I go.
right, good morning, everybody. Why don't we get started? Good morning and welcome to the Chamber. This is an event that is actually, and our agenda is a collaboration between the Capital Markets Center and CTech from our Chamber divisions. So we welcome you all here, and Tim Day will be here a little bit later from CTech. America's entrepreneurs and business owners need access to efficient capital markets in order to start a business, grow a business, and create jobs. A financial system can only be effective if it is both innovative and dynamic. Accordingly, we thought it was important to look at the issues surrounding FinTech and to come up with a policy agenda to help spur that innovation. FinTech means many things to many people. It could be the rise of new industries and businesses, but it is also about existing firms changing their business models and their way of doing business. It's about new technology creating novel ways of, novel means of transacting finances. And this is not a zero-sum game. We must have a level playing field for all participants. Innovation at its core is nothing new. It is at the heart of a free enterprise system. However, we must have an appropriately balanced regulatory system that allows for growth while providing certainty and protection for investors and consumers. Unfortunately, when it comes to FinTech, we either have a Byzantine set of regulations or none at all. We have new products being viewed through the lens of policies set during the New Deal, the age of the typewriter and the ticker tape machine. Make no mistake, this is also hurting American competitiveness. As the UK and EU are creating a hospitable environment, the US is being left behind. For the nation that created the internet and cloud computing, do we want to lose out during the age of blockchain, initial coin offerings, and online lending? We hope that the upcoming Treasury report will help to settle some of those issues. Kate Prohaska will offer some of our thoughts, and we'll have discussion with business and policy leaders. So let me introduce our first speaker. Congressman Patrick McHenry from North Carolina, many of you know him well, is the Chief Deputy Whip of the House of Representatives. He has also been a leader in developing innovative financial policies. Congressman McHenry was one of the first proponents of crowdfunding, was a leader in developing the Jobs Act, and his HALOS bill was a major piece of the Jobs Act 3.0 that passed the House last night. Congressman McHenry has also been a leading advocate of the sandbox approach for FinTech policies. So with that, let me welcome Congressman McHenry to the stage.
Well, thank you, Tom, and I certainly appreciate the Chamber and the Center for Capital Markets Competitiveness hosting this morning. This is the mainstay of changing the regulatory state in a positive direction for capital markets to continue to flourish in the United States. So thank you for the leadership here, and thank you all for being here. This morning, I want to talk to you in a little different way than most of the conversations we have here in Washington. Most of the conversations, and we'll have that today, about the nature of what is now, right? What is in the present, and what are we grinding through on Capitol Hill, in the regulatory state, in the here and now. The deliverables that you all have to take back to respective firms, or the work that you're trying to achieve immediately. But I want to talk a little more broadly about mindset here. And I want you to think through, when we're talking about the future of banking, let's take Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1. And his contrarian question that he poses is, ask yourself this: what important truth do very few people agree with you on? Right? So this is a great question because it forces you to escape the thinking of the past. It forces you to uncover the types of truisms that you embrace that perhaps the market will move to and accept very soon. Now, let's a couple of examples of this, okay? So the revolutionary concept that people are going to pay for bottled water, right? The revolutionary concept that you're going to take a bag and put wheels on it, and you'll drag it behind you, right? Seems self-evident now, right? Especially when you get your toes knocked in by other people's rollerboards. Or the idea that you're going to have complete strangers sleeping in your house, right? these sort of concepts, or somebody that has 30 million Twitter followers and a hit show is going to be president of the United States, right? Well, okay, I won't get into that this morning. But anyway, so here's my answer to the contrarian question. The underlying assumption in Washington seems to be if you can uncover why we are in the position we're currently in, that you can fix the position we're currently in, right? So you understand the history of the regulatory state, why we are where we are, and that will help inform how you shift this thing. And I don't think we can figure things out now, in the here and now, especially with the future of banking, by looking to the past. And I say this as a lover of history, as a student of history, and as somebody who spends an enormous amount of time studying the past to inform the future. But this is something that I think is a powerful concept when we're talking through the changing regulatory state and the changing nature of banking, and especially when it comes to FinTech and what that will mean to the future of banking. So let's talk through that. And I want to just have sort of a mindset conversation rather than the details of how we're going to legislate. Let's talk about the concept of how we should view the here and now and the future of banking. So you're asking yourself, why in the heck am I going in this direction, right? I think we have to have a fundamental shift after a decade of hard-fought battles on Dodd-Frank. We have to have a mindset shift 10 years after the federal government took possession of Fannie and Freddie. 10 years last week, in fact. Not a healthy anniversary. We have to have a mindset shift given that we've spent a decade in order to get a few dozen changes to Dodd-Frank. We have to have a mindset shift instead of taking those resources and plowing into the battles of the past so that we can move this conversation forward. Now, this is very difficult given the nature of Washington and very difficult given the nature of our politics at the moment. But it's not just Peter Thiel that informs this, but Niall Ferguson in the conversation of the new, not quite so new now, but the Tower and the Square, and this concept of what the future looks like. And we're moving into this networked age and the capacity of using that networked age to have greater societal shifts and the consequences of those shifts. So after a decade of getting the results of a technical corrections bill, in essence, signed into law by the president on Dodd-Frank, and now a great vote last night in the House of Representatives on changes to Dodd-Frank, let's have the conversation about what's next. So the future is happening whether or not we move forward. And the future is happening in the marketplace. And the consumers are driving this marketplace shift and the demands that are put on the banking system as a result. And, you know, for us to have the conversation about FinTech, I think sort of misses the point. It's like calling Amazon an e-commerce website, or do you have a website as a part of a business, or you're an online something. This is just an essential part of the conversation 20 years after Web 1.0. So let's go beyond that. The basic way that consumers are interacting with the banking system is fundamentally shifting. The way small businesses across America get access to capital is already shifted dramatically. And the foundational principles of banking, including the ledger system and centralized sources of financing, are fundamentally changing. We're in the midst of this. Now, my fear is that if we don't do everything we can in Washington to meet these new challenges for the future of banking, then the future of our most sacred institutions like community banks are in doubt. As a result of the financial crisis and the decades since, we've lost over 10,000 branches. That's nearly 3 a day since the financial crisis. 10,000 branches, not banks. This is the conversation we normally have is about banks. But what happens when you lose a branch? We now have 3.7 million people that live in what is, in essence, a bank desert. We talk about food deserts in urban areas. We have bank deserts in America now as a result of losing branches. And when you don't have access to a branch, you don't have access to a live person, you don't have access to those basic banking functions that we need and rely upon. This is happening not just in urban areas, but it's happening in rural areas as well. And the unity of those two is something that presents us a great opportunity on Capitol Hill to work through how we help those rural concerns, that are on the margins in rural areas, and those that are on the margins in urban areas. So let's talk through the concept of where we are with banking. I think we're at the Kodak moment. Now, let's talk about Kodak, a great American institution. And I don't know if you know this or not, but Kodak actually invented the technology for digital photography. And the leadership of Kodak made the assumption that we as consumers would not want to look at photos on a television screen. Now, Steve Jobs forever changed that. The fascinating thing about this is that they saw slow processing, which was speeding up daily, hourly, and the computing capacity was changing so dramatically. Yet they were stuck in the present. They were stuck in the past. And so, looking at this corporate giant, the wake-up call came in 2005, when Kodak's digital sales and actually global digital photography surpassed print in 2005. It's also the same year that Kodak reported $1 billion loss. Now, fast forward. Bankrupt company, in order to try to save themselves, what do they say? What do they offer? Well, they try to go for an ICO and come up with Kodak coin, right? Proof that they are grasping for the future, even though they missed that opportunity, that inflection point. And now today, we take more pictures in a week than we did in a decade in the 80s. It's dramatically shifted in our utilization of that technology Kodak created. So what does this mean for banking, and what does this mean for the regulatory state? So we all know that the branch closures are happening, but the real story is in branch transactions. In less than a decade, in-branch transactions have dropped by a third. On average, people visit branches only 7 times a year. So perhaps losing a branch in your community isn't as devastating as it once was. And according to industry estimates, banking app transactions will more than double in the next 5 years. And those assumptions are always low because of the uptake rate in technology. But here's how it's different than Kodak. We all know that banking is not dealing with photography. We know it's not just a couple of characters on the screen. This is America's safety net, our homes, our retirement, our livelihood that we put in these trusted institutions. And they have our most sensitive data, our most prized and sensitive data. And here's where I think the conversation about disruption in the financial services industry is wrong. We're not dealing with somebody borrowing your car, and we're not talking about getting a ride. We're talking about this highly sensitive data. So to hear this disruption idea, or that we're going to have an upstart in the financial services industry that comes out of a garage, is misguided. I think we have FinTech leaders that are established players right now that are making massive investments in this change. Now, what is not changing is the regulatory footprint here in Washington. So instead of just looking at the past on this, we have to work through how we utilize AI in the regulatory state, how we take the blockchain technology and we bring it to the public sphere, how we shift how notice and comment works for the regulatory structure, how we communicate with members of Congress, and how we communicate with regulators has to shift. And the utilization of big data is that breakthrough agent that needs to be well distributed across our federal footprint. But the federal government is more than a decade behind in technology, and every administration, last administration and this administration, has thrown enormous resources in trying to make this shift, just to make sure that consumers can go log on to healthcare.gov that cost many multiples cost just to have that one website than it did to develop the iPhone. So we have to change the way Washington works and the regulatory state works. So what's the conclusion? Change is happening in the present, and it's time that Washington focuses less on problems that were unsolved in the past and the battles that were won or lost and the resources that were put into an old fight. We have to shift to the new fight on how we change this regulatory structure and embrace this new frontier that's filled with unknown opportunities, challenges, and hope for the banking system and for our greater financial system. It's going to require courage, creativity, and leadership and new thinking. And it's going to require us to change and choose principles over rhetoric, common sense over partisanship in order to get through this divide that we have on Capitol Hill and the divide we have in this country rhetorically when it comes to banking. And we have to realize that the rest of the world is not only caught up, but they have surpassed us in many, many key areas. Utilization of AI, for instance, and big data. London is beating us on financial technology. They've been much more nimble in changing and adapting and embracing technology. China is beating us on digital currencies. And even in remote places like Kenya, they're going well beyond our capacity with mobile payments and the movement of small dollar transactions between individuals. Their marketplace is much more vibrant than ours in terms of payments and the movement of money. So we have to embrace change in a way that is different from the mindset that we've had as Americans, that we're the domicile of global capital here in the United States. And we have to recognize people have great choices around the globe that in many places are much more competitive, much more open than we are. We have to return back to those principles that we've had that made us the global capital for the world's reserves and the global capital of finance. If we don't embrace this change, we will be left behind, and we will be struggling with many of the things that we've seen great nations struggle with if we don't embrace this change. I know we have the capacity to do this, but we have to learn from this new marketplace. We have to learn from Peter Thiel, we have to learn from Niall Ferguson, and adapt that to the staid thing of the Washington regulatory space and that boring institution of Congress. So thank you for being here. Thank you for having this engagement. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about a mindset shift and something that we can embrace to make a difference for the next generation and for the next 50 years here in Washington and for our country. Thanks so much. God bless.
First, thank you to Congressman McHenry for those remarks. I could not agree more. And that's exactly why we want to have this conversation today. For those of you who don't know me, Kate Larson Prohaska now. So if there's any confusion, that's why. But I just wanted to do a little bit deeper dive and kind of unwrap what he just discussed. I mean, I think that oftentimes what we are doing is having the discussion about the last crisis instead of looking forward to the technologies that are coming forward or what the next crisis may be. So that is why we are having this discussion today and why we're launching our initiative here at the Chamber. Over the last decade, chatter about financial technology or FinTech has really crescendoed, and I think that we need to have the conversation to kind of separate myth from fact and really dig down on the deeper products that are available instead of just looking at the broader FinTech umbrella, because that encompasses so many diverse things. Buzzwords like blockchain, cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence have seeped into our vocabulary. I know I hadn't heard of blockchain a couple years ago. Now I'm reading books on it and getting, very well versed on it. But I think it really begs the question, especially for those of us in DC, what do these words all mean? I think my biggest concern is that when these new shiny objects come along, we immediately want to do something or jump on a bill or start regulating. And before regulators take up the pen, I think it's really critical that we understand the benefits and potential harms of these new financial technologies. So again, that's why we're launching the U.S. Chamber's FinTech Innovation Initiative. So it brings together financial services participants from, traditional banking institutions to online lenders, blockchain companies, cryptocurrency companies, and I think that the Chamber is really uniquely positioned to bring together everyone kind of under that umbrella. So the principles that you have before you today are months of work that we put together with our members. So it was interesting, while writing these principles to see kind of what traditional financial institutions think about it, or, new small dollar product lenders, people that are just strictly online, P2P or B2B. So there are so many different aspects under this FinTech umbrella. So what we really want to start doing is defining what those things are under this massive category. So in the principles, I just want to go over them very briefly and see if anybody has any questions. And obviously, you want to hear from Congressman McHenry and Congressman Hill, so I'm in a tricky sandwich right here, but I'll go quickly, I promise. So going through, we have 8 main principles. So 1, to encourage safe innovation in the financial sector, whether by a new entrant, or traditional financial institution, or by a joint initiative, or by both. So what we hear a lot, 5 years, 10 years ago, is that fintechs are going to disrupt banks out of existence. I think that we all know that's not really the case at this point. There seems to be a lot of synergies and collaboration between the two. So what we're looking at trying to make that more possible, and what my boss David Hirschman always says is to have the 32 flavors of capital. So looking at the different types of products and services that consumers and different businesses need because they are so unique. So 2, to streamline the fragmented regulatory structure, so any financial service provider that serves a national multi-state market has one set of rules to abide by instead of a complex state rules and multiple federal agencies. That's exactly what Congressman McHenry was just mentioning. There are kind of antiquated rules, whether there are state-by-state money transmitter laws. Well, Singapore, China, the UK, there's really one regulator that a organization can go to and, ask for what the clear rules of the road are. And I think that is the complexity that we have here. So 3, to foster partnerships between new entrants and incumbent financial institutions while minimizing the burden of vendor management requirements. So again, monopolizing on the different fintech companies. I know that a lot of larger banks are building in-house, but oftentimes mid-size, regional, or smaller institutions, it's great for them to partner with a fintech platform in order to better serve their customers. So making sure that is easier. There aren't 4 different audits, or months of due diligence that they have to do in order to actually partner with each other. So 4, support policies and promote expanded financial access to affordable and accessible credit for underserved communities for both households and small businesses. So in my work in the consumer finance space, we hear a lot of, how low and moderate income consumers aren't getting served. And as Mr. McHenry mentioned, branches are going away. I think that's just the reality that we know. The financial services sector is changing oftentimes just because people, I frankly don't go to a branch very often. I think 7 times a year has actually seemed pretty high to me. And so seeing how we can better serve consumers who don't have traditional access to credit, whether that's having alternative data entries or different things like that, and being able to do remote deposit capture or other things, especially for folks in rural areas that aren't by traditional institutions and branches. So enriching financial literacy through multiple platforms to reach consumers, investors, small business owners who need it most. I think a lot of problems that arise within our country is simply from a lack of knowledge. So, for people who don't know immediately, what a credit score is and how important that is to get a good one, once you enter college and start building that credit, I think that leads to a lot of faults later in life. So making sure that people are aware of that to begin with, and make sure that we're moving forward with an educated kind of populace and making sure we have those information out there. So 6, educate policymakers about the benefits of financial innovation and the opportunities to serve the customers and small business owners who may not have affordable access to credit. Again, this is why we're having this forum today, and obviously there's a lot of discussion around DC and what FinTech is, but we wanted to bring everyone together and make sure to have a comprehensive discussion. I go to the Hill and speak with policymakers, and sometimes, there's confusion about if Bitcoin and blockchain are the same things, and, different things like that. And so what we're trying to do is really educate and make sure that there isn't, people that are quick to jump to to regulate on innovations, so that we don't see the fruits actually come to fruition. And then protect consumer privacy, create best practices for cybersecurity protections, and develop safe ways for consumers to manage their digital identity. So when we sat down with members, I think this is what we heard over and over again, is the fact that consumers need to be able to control their own digital identity. That is, incredibly important, as we've seen lately with different data breaches and compromised data. I think that consumers are becoming more and more aware of all the data that is being collected, and we just need to make sure that the right protections are put in place in that area. And then to promote new and innovative ways to access capital, such as initial coin offerings, ICOs, while advocating for tailored oversight and strong consumer and investor protections. ICOs, obviously, is the new kind of buzzword that we're hearing about, but the fact that there is such a declining amount of IPOs, people are looking for a new and innovative way to access capital. The regulatory environment has become so cumbersome that we don't want to eradicate, initial coin offerings just because there are some bad actors in the marketplace. And instead, the SEC has been great about coming out with some guidance on this issue, and we hope that they just come out with further guidance to come. So that is kind of our overview, and I know that you have a lot more in front of you, but just wanted to just kind of give a general insight on what we were doing and kind of the impetus for this meeting today, and see if there were any questions. Okay, great. We'll refresh your coffee and we'll wait for Mr. Hill to join us. Thank you all so much again for coming.
I'd make a deal with God, and I get him to swallow. saying it's hopeless, that I should hope less. Heaven can help us, well maybe she might. You say it's beyond us, what is beyond us? Let's see and decide. We've been meteoric even before this. Burns half as long when it's twice as bright. So if it's beyond us, then it's beyond us. Let's see and decide. And I will still be here, stargazing. I still look up, look up, look up for love. I will still be here, stargazing. I still look up, look up, look up for love.
All right, everyone, our next guest has arrived. If you can take your seats, please. Wow, that was easy. Thank you. All right, so just to give you, I think, everybody here knows who Mr. French Hill is, but prior to his election in Congress in 2014, Congressman Hill built an experienced background in financial services, both in the private and public sectors. His career started in the First National Bank of Dallas. Then he formed a new company, Financial Interchange. He then came up to D.C., worked for Senate Banking Committee, and served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Corporate Finance in the George H.W. Bush's administration. He then returned home to Little Rock to run a community bank for nearly 2 decades. After leading a thriving community bank, Mr. Hill successfully ran for the U.S. House of Representatives in 2014. I can't believe it was that recently because he has made such a name for himself over the past couple years, and he was sworn in January of 2015. As a member of Congress, Representative Hill serves on the House Committee of Financial Services and 3 of its subcommittees: capital markets, trade and terrorism, and illicit finance. Mr. Hill has been very involved in financial services legislation, as we all know, and I will turn it over to him. Thank you so much, everyone.
Good morning. How's everybody? You've already heard from Patrick McHenry, so you must be wide awake. Hope you didn't have any trouble seeing him up here. It's good to be back in the historic Chamber building, and nice to have a chance to talk about FinTech. And I want to take a little different perspective. Tom and I'll talk a little bit about some public policy aspects in a minute. But I wanted to start out and use Little Rock, Arkansas as a case study for what I think is moving throughout our country. And this is really terrific because this is exactly what we want from a public policy point of view, from a jobs creation point of view, from an expansion of entrepreneurship. And you can look at the premise that Steve Case had in his book, Third Wave, and I think that's sort of the right way to think about this from a structural point of view. We've moved from the online world of AOL discs and dial-up in the 1990s and learning how to play Myst CD-ROM games, which we were so blown away by, to an app and mobile economy, which we're in today, that we all now completely take for granted. But what's coming next is what Steve argues is the third wave, which is the Internet of Things. And that's where we're just, we don't even know what the potential is there. But clearly, FinTech will be a principal mover in that third wave. It will be a game changer for all incumbent players in our economy. So if we have that, we know that instinctively, we take Steve Case's premise at heart, then we have to think about what's the broader ramifications for the economy across the country. And there's been a lot of discussion about income inequality over the slow economic growth years of the Obama administration post-recession. And there's a lot of conversation about how the economy restarted and how narrow that restart was post-recession. For example, you had over 50% of the job growth following the bottom in the spring of '09 occurred in just 20 markets. Over 50% of the job growth only took place in about 20 markets, MSAs in the United States, from the trough. That's unparalleled in its narrowness. And every one of those MSAs had an NFL football team, except for Austin, Texas. So I call it the NFL city halo effect, where you have that urbanization and job creation all centered in those environments. So Steve Case postulates, again, the rise of the rest. And he outlines what he thinks is essential to the rise of the rest. Now, when he wrote that book, he wasn't thinking about this thing I've talked about for 3 years now, which is this NFL city effect, but that is what he's talking about. And so what I want to describe to you today is what we're doing in Little Rock, which is contributing to that effort of Rise for the Rest. And I want to credit the fact that it's the Little Rock Chamber of Commerce that was the instigator of this effort. But Steve says Denver, Kansas City, Austin, Buffalo are all rising with entrepreneurship, startup business rates, participating in what will be this third wave. He argues that nodes of research and industry expertise guide what direction those third wave cities will be. So Little Rock is well known for, obviously, agriculture. We're the country's largest rice producer in Arkansas, and about a third of our GDP is ag-related, and a lot in the poultry industry. You're familiar with Tyson Foods in Arkansas. So ag is certainly something the state's well known for. FinTech, which I'll talk about in a minute. Big data analytics, that's the headquarters of Axiom, which was in the news recently, which is the originator of the concept of big data behind-the-scenes analytics, which has driven all the financial innovation of the last 35 or 40 years on why you get so many credit card solicitations. And the power grid. Little Rock is uniquely positioned in the power industry. The Southwest Power Pool is headquartered there, which controls all the power for 18 states in the United States. And MISO, which is Entergy's power grid sharing organization, is headquartered there also, which governs a lot of the power in the Midwest. So those nodes of influence, research, and employment, I think, make Little Rock a productive place for third wave technology in those arenas. Today, I want to talk about particularly what we're doing in FinTech and credit, what we're doing at Little Rock Chamber and the Little Rock Venture Center. And at the heart of that is a major commitment by our governor, Asa Hutchinson, who has promoted coding in K through 12 schools. He now has been recognized as having the best program for encouraging coding all the way through K through 12, with a high school mandate that all students participate in coding. And so Asa is moving us in that direction as our governor, and he's also backed the Venture Center and what I'm going to describe financially at the state level. But the real impetus for FinTech is FIS, Fidelity Information Systems, headquartered in Jacksonville, Florida, employs over 50,000 people worldwide, but that company had its start in Little Rock back in 1968 as Systematics, which, like EDS, Ross Perot's company, was one of the earliest outsourcing data processing bank back office technology companies in the country. And Fidelity now has 20,000 clients in over 130 countries, and they've selected Little Rock as their North American FinTech sandbox hub. So let me click through these, if I can do this. Right here, point at this one? Yeah. So the Venture Center was a partnership between the Chamber, the business community, and the city of Little Rock. It's patterned on what MIT's done in Cambridge and Boston, and how they've expanded that program into St. Louis and some other markets that the Venture Center in Boston is operating on. It's been recognized by the Startup Champions Network, the International Business Innovation Association, and Startup Federation as a model example of how this rise of the rest operation can operate off the East and West Coast in flyover country. And you can see that the startups just in the last 4 years, 57 million raised in private equity and generating over 30 million in revenue, and produced 637 jobs in that 4-year effort through the work of FIS and the Venture Center in Little Rock. I want to put that in perspective. I was the chamber chairman in 2013 when we initiated this effort, and so I'm proud of it, but I also can compare it to the work starting in the 1990s. I was a founding director of our Bio Venture Center at the University of Arkansas Medical Center in Little Rock, who's been functioning since 1998, trying to commercialize biomedical type research out of the University of Arkansas's med school. It doesn't compare to this. A tougher nut to some degree, longer tail on innovations in medicine, but I just emphasize that I think this is exactly the right kind of model for something to happen in 4 years. FIS, as I say, is our sponsor. You can see their innovation hubs around the world that they have in Southeast Asia and in Little Rock as a FinTech. What do they do that's essential to a sandbox? They bring customers. They bring the data flow to the entrepreneur, essentially granted to them for free in order to test their FinTech idea, and then they market the future sandbox companies to their clients. So the entrepreneur gets capital, the entrepreneur gets mentorship and expertise, and the entrepreneur gets something that every entrepreneur dreams of, a sales pipeline. So that's what I think is the secret to FIS's leadership here. The key focus areas for the competition for their FinTech accelerator are AI, data analytics, wealth management, so business to consumer, the use of blockchain, interrupting the lending platform process, so again, business to consumer, mobile, the payments process, and then security authentication on verification of private information in the supply chain for a financial product. What they've done now, this is the 3rd year, is select the best FinTech ideas from around the world. So this year, the class had 281 applications from 47 countries and 26 states and 6 continents, and they selected the 10 best candidates to come to Little Rock. They all receive a capital injection, they all receive mentorship, they all receive this sandbox environment that I've described. And we're in process right now, and today in Little Rock, which is fun for me, this is demo day in Little Rock. So these 10 companies will now all do their pitches today in a Shark Tank environment in Little Rock, and delighted Governor Hutchinson will be there this afternoon to welcome their success. Here's a look at those companies and some of the highlights on fundraising, and these are from previous years about the recognition they've had. And again, if anybody has an interest in this, I invite you to go to the Venture Center website in Little Rock, or be happy to contact my office. But I've been impressed with the quality of the portfolio companies in the two previous years, but I think this year is the best. I thought they were so good, I invited Kevin McCarthy, who you know loves a Shark Tank experience, to come down to Little Rock for a preliminary pitch session with 4 or 5 of them in May, and we had a great time. And I hope you'll read about them on the website. And if anybody has an idea to help them grow and prosper, don't hesitate to reach out to those companies. Tom, thanks for letting me visit and give you a preview of what's happening in Little Rock today with our Venture Center and our FIS Accelerator. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. And Congressman Hill, thank you for that overview of the Venture Center. When you and I had done that event, with the Little Rock Chamber a couple years ago on Main Street banking issues, I wish I'd known about that. I would have liked to have heard a little bit more.
Come back.
Yeah, I will. I will definitely take you up on that. It was very interesting because I had a meeting with the company in New York yesterday, and they do they're back office vendor, and they ran into some trouble a couple of years ago. And what they decided to do is they created 3 innovation centers. So where I met with them yesterday was their innovation center in New York, but then they have 2 in other parts of the country. And they now have about 10% of their workforce is technology, or people who work in technology. So you had mentioned Steve Case, and I know Steve Case and J.D. Vance are really engaged in this effort to try and bring Silicon Valley out of the coast into the center of the country. So do you see things like the Venture Center being replicated in other parts of the country?
I do. I see it, whenever I travel, I try to stop in and ask what's happening in that venture arena. And St. Louis is a good example, I think. They've put up local capital, created the environment to be successful on an incubator, office space, mentorship. And they actually partnered with MIT's Venture Center in Cambridge, and it's sort of a managerial contract where St. Louis puts up the local talent, the local capital, the local space, but they've contracted with MIT's Venture Center effectively to run it. I think it's one reason why Google selected St. Louis as a spot to expand their footprint in the lower 48. And you see this, Steve talks about the experience in Buffalo. And I've seen it generally when I travel. I think the key is, as I noted, what are the local educational resources, business entrepreneurial resources there? The Kauffman Foundation has recognized this. It's a great place for, if people are interested, to go see what they think who's doing a good job. I think the Kauffman Foundation is particularly good at expanding entrepreneurship in flyover land between the East and West Coast. Kansas City is another excellent model. Mr. Hellsberg, who sold the Hellsberg Jewelry Company to Warren Buffett about 15 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago now, he and his family have dedicated in a partnership with Kauffman, having, I think, one of the best mentorship programs for young entrepreneurs in Kansas City. And they're a real model on mentorship. And I would say the same at the Venture Center in Nashville, Tennessee. So I think there's some great examples.
Yeah, I think Pittsburgh is a great example of that too. And I think one of the things that is common with all of the those different places, they have a lot of important educational facilities or institutions in and around where those cities are located.
Right. Governor Hutchinson also just contributed $500,000 to the University of Central Arkansas, which is in Conway, Arkansas, also in the state's finest congressional district, about 20 minutes from Little Rock. And he essentially duplicated the United States Air Force cyber range. So the exact same sandbox cyber range used by our national security trainers at the Air Force is now in place at University of Central Arkansas. And we're going to do that in collaboration with our Air Guard and with the U.S. Air Force. Senator Bozeman, I've worked to protect the SCIF. The old Intel unit at the Air Base has a 10,000 square foot state-of-the-art SCIF on base. We're now converting that from its former use to a cyber training effort. So we're, I think, uniting ably industry, academia, and the Air Force and Little Rock in that process.
So I guess bringing it back down, bringing it back to Washington a little bit, because from your perch on the Financial Services Committee, I mean, Mr. McHenry was talking about it a little bit this morning. We've been involved in a lot of Dodd-Frank fights, or putting together the new Jobs Act 3.0, whatever else. But when people start to talk about FinTech, sometimes we're talking about different components. It could be blockchain, AI, all these different things. Yeah. How do you view this from your perch on the committee? And also let me ask it a little differently too, because you're different as well, because you obviously have had vast experience at the Treasury Department as well as being a business owner. So how do you see all this sort of developing?
Well, I think the challenge for entrepreneurs, and I hear it whenever I meet with them, Patrick and I did an event in Chicago together with one of their incubator programs, and I heard it there, and I hear it even, in Little Rock with some of the client companies of the Venture Center today, and that is, gosh, when I came up with my brilliant idea to make loans online and never take a loss, or I came up with my brilliant idea of robo-investing and the portfolios are better than Lake Wobegon, or whatever their FinTech brilliant suggestion is, they go, man, I didn't know we had to comply with state law. So this idea of that we're in a constitutional republic and we have state law rights and sovereign state law rights, I think has been a real rude awakening to single platform, national distribution type solutions. And so that is, I think, one frustration I hear. And then the other is, well, we don't have facilities. We're going to be completely virtual. So why do we need to bother with all these commercial bank or investment banking rules and regulations? They don't really apply to us because we wouldn't think about discriminating, and we're just an open platform thing. So we want to lower the cost. So that federal regulatory burden and that state law expectation, I think, are two of the challenges with FinTech. And what I've seen and what I like about the Venture Center is with FIS, with 20,000 clients and their data stream, they're able to isolate a payments process idea, a lending approval process idea, a wealth management activity, and isolate that data in a safe and secure financial environment, and then perfect the idea. Mm-hmm. And then for them, because of that client development, they can partner with someone who already complies with all 50 state legal frameworks, regulatory frameworks, or has permissions, securities or banking to engage, lowering the barrier for the idea to be expanded. So to me, right now, if I were a FinTech innovator right now, I'd be focused on partnership. And I don't think I'm giving up some great economic upside by that concept.
So it's a little bit of a different form of passporting.
Right. Now, Mr. Otting wants to pursue a FinTech charter, and the Treasury is going to issue a report on maybe some best practices in this arena. Those are good things. But fundamentally, we want to get all the benefits of disintermediating, I'll use that term, bureaucracy, agency costs, either B2B or B2C, but we can't abdicate our consumer protection, investor protection, or fair lending obligations in the process.
Right.
And I think that's a challenge for entrepreneurs, but I believe that the best way to work around that is this idea of partnering with people who've already paid the price dearly for compliance. And then through that, maybe we'll find a third way to achieve that.
One of the things that Mr. McHenry sort of was talking about this morning, maybe in terms of a third way, is, look, clearly we've got FinTech rising, and you have new entrants into the market, you have existing, companies changing, whatever. But he was also talking about it in the vantage point of, should we use this as a disruptive moment for our regulatory agencies, right? So making sure we have the certainty that business needs, making sure that we have protections for investors and consumers, but then radically changing how those agencies actually go about and do their business. Do you think we're at that point yet, or is that something that is independent of, let's say, FinTech, or is FinTech going to drive that?
Well, I would hope that it could be a driver and compel government to change. Government doesn't change easily with or without an appropriations process, and it is reluctant to innovate, and you can just visit your local DMV to see that. Some states have done an extraordinary job of government to consumer improvements in something like that, others not so much. So I see it as a disruptor to change federal policy. And again, I'll cite Mr. Otting's desire as he enters as our comptroller of the currency at OCC with, can we take a fresh look at CRA, for example? CRA 1977-78 timeframe is all about community reinvestment, avoiding any kind of redlining or lending discrimination, compelling participation by commercial banks fairly throughout their geographic service area. Mm-hmm. What does that mean now? In an age of reduced physical locations, but more consumer participation in the financial marketplace. So that really is it's an ideal time to completely rethink the premise and see how technology could deliver better compliance, better outcomes, better consumer selection, choice.
Well, you know, when 3 or 4 years ago, when the policy discussions around this really started to take off, at that time there was at least in the marketplace, it was, you had the new entrants coming in and you had existing firms that were feeling under pressure. And it seemed to be a little bit of like a new versus old debate. Whereas today, I think that has shifted a little bit to where you're seeing existing firms either developing their own technologies or acquiring technologies. So do you think this is that new versus old debate, or is this something where we're seeing a marketplace really start to transform, let's say even in a way that we had, 100+ years ago with, how banking was changing with some of the technologies then?
I think it's becoming more transformative as we move away from the shock of the statements I made earlier. Gosh, there are a lot of federal compliance laws I have to comply with for my good idea. Or I didn't know you have to register this idea in 50 states. The sort of shock of that moment as an entrepreneur is behind us. And now people are saying, well, let's move on. And so I think it's poised to become more transformational through the partnership idea we talked about, or simply let's recognize that and use technology to work around it and create that full encompassing platform that maybe we don't even have to do the partnership. The other thing I think that has burdened entrepreneurs and willing investor partners, say a community bank, so step out of big bank innovators at the top of the financial food chain and go into people who want to maintain their own private independent business, something I believe strongly in. We need more banks of more sizes across the country and not continue to concentrate wealth in the hands of ever-growing large national and international SIFI-type banks. Well, a real burden to a bank management team is IT compliance exams, information technology compliance exams, the vendor review. If you innovate something I love as a new gateway platform to doing mortgage loan applications, and I love it, and it does cut people, time, better outcomes, innovation, and I want to partner with you, I'll have a really hard time in my next bank exam.
Right.
And I've told Mr. Otting, as you look at this whole arena, doing better guidance on emerging technology partnerships for banks will really encourage more banks to participate with equity capital and partner capital. And right now, that is a real risk area, I think, for a typical medium-sized bank. These would be really anybody under that $50 billion type size.
It's also a competitiveness issue, right? I had a meeting a few months ago with the CEO of a blockchain company. And what he was concerned about, he goes, I'm an American. I want to do my business here in the U.S. But you know what? The UK and the EU are moving pretty quickly on, setting up a regulatory regime that we're going to have to live with. And he goes, if that continues, you're going to see a shift of technology going from the U.S. over to Europe. And, we've also seen President Macron from France being very aggressive. And he's actually touting that as being an aggressive way to bring business from the U.S. over to the EU, and obviously we have China being very aggressive in terms of AI. So whereas, previously we were sort of able to move at our own pace because we were the dominant player on the block or what, that's not necessarily the case anymore. So how is it that we need to be more nimble? And do you see this as being a good thing or a bad thing in terms of global competition?
Well, I think the global competition is good. I think it will sharpen our efforts and wake up both policymakers, academia, and business executives that this is an area they need to explore. We've seen Depository Trust do blockchain testing in the custody arena for financial assets. We've seen Walmart look at blockchain and logistics issues. Blockchain to me is a real immediate investment and research opportunity for almost every business in the country and in the world. And so I see it a major area to research. In public policy, what does that mean? Well, you can think about changing internal audit standards.
Yeah.
You can think about what a topsy-turvy that would do to the people who've made a fortune since 2002, forcing people to comply with Section 404 in Sarbanes-Oxley, for example. So tremendous upheaval on that.
Yeah.
But to me, it's an extension of innovation that goes way beyond the headlines, which is all tangled up in cryptocurrencies and all this kind of stuff. We need to be looking at blockchain as an innovative technology for a core mainstream business and as a way to reduce agency costs in a supply chain, in an accounts receivable and payable function, in verification of international trade verification and customs duties. I mean, you can really, and it could really unleash innovation in the federal government if that's not an oxymoronic thing to try to say here.
Well, how is it that we can also get the regulators to think about this in a different way? Because I was at a conference at IOSCO 3 years ago. So IOSCO is the top 35 securities regulators around the world, and the SEC is an important part of that. And they had a great discussion for 2 hours about blockchain, about bringing settling and clearing down from T+2 to T+4 down to close to real time. And I got up and I asked the question, well, this is great, but if you now think about blockchain and everybody's connected through a similar ledger, that's disruptive for disclosures, right? And somebody got up right behind me and said, well, if you think about it in that way, why do you still need an audited financial statement? Now, you fast forward 3 years now, the auditors will tell you they're actually using or beginning to use a lot of this technology that will transform the audit in the next 3 years. So in 3 years, the audit is going to be fundamentally different than what it's been for the last 120. But I had another meeting with IOSCO about 6 weeks ago, and I raised this again, and their thinking hadn't really evolved. And I think that's just indicative of what securities regulators are, sort of where they are generally on this. So how is it that we can help them maybe,
That's a good point.
Yeah, get a little further along?
Well, I referenced it. I think it's people looking at the headline instead of reading the story. So the headline is Jay Clayton and ICOs and what the price of a cryptocurrency is and who's going to have a cryptocurrency exchange and is it a commodity versus a security. Those are all the headlines. And to me, they are an utter distraction from this issue of blockchain as a potentially evolutionary issue. So I think the hearing should be about across the Congress, whether you're in the Energy and Commerce Committee or in the Financial Services Committee or Ways and Means, have a series of hearings where private industry comes in, academia comes in, and talks about transformation of the blockchain in a normal business process and begin raising boards of directors and CEOs' awareness of that and policymakers on how they're supposed to react to it and recognize that it is an international phenomena, and some countries are able to move more quickly than others just by virtue of their legal or regulatory regime. And then our policymakers, Randy Quarles or Jay Clayton, in the financial sector, just have to make sure that it's a standing committee process of our international regulators to say this is an emerging reality. We need to be in front of it and not behind it.
You all right if we take a question or two from the floor?
Sure, of course, yeah.
Last couple of minutes. So any questions from the floor? Congressman French Hill? We've got a quiet crowd here.
It is.
this morning.
They're
I don't know why
very
that is.
attentive. They stayed up too late watching baseball.
Yeah, no, I guess so. All the home runs just had them in a tizzy. We've got a question right here.
Hi. AI or FinTech or, autonomous vehicles, et cetera. How can U.S. legislators work more closely with our European counterparts to replicate or bring across some of their ability to be more agile in regulations in response to new technology?
And we've certainly seen that in data protection and data disclosure recently. Is just a compliance issue that we're struggling with right now to get a data security bill through Energy and Commerce and Financial Services. And here the EU lays out a very strict EU-centric, approach as a compliance example of what you're talking about. I think the standard-setting bodies and the regulatory bodies, as I say, need to have this as a standing conversation. And I believe that whether it's Randy Quarles on behalf of the Fed, has to come to the Hill and say, we're seeing this moving faster. We need to move faster. I just argue that it's not just a financial sector issue. It is a cross-industry sector, and it's an obligation of each committee, chairman of the House and Senate, and their staffs, to avail themselves of that speed, that knowledge, that benchmarking, and see how to ensure that the United States remains in a preeminent position on innovation.
One of the things that Kevin Warsh talked about recently was that if he had become the head of the Fed, that he thought it was important for them to look at coming up with something called FedCoin, or the Federal Reserve actually coming up with its own cryptocurrency. Do you see that developing, or do you think that might be something that's just something nice to talk about?
That doesn't sound like a good idea to me.
Okay, fair enough. One last question from the floor.
Hi. So one of the things that, when we have a conversation about FinTech and partnerships and what the regulatory bodies can do to be more responsive, one of the things I always think about is this idea that what are the incentives on the regulatory agencies to actually be innovative and responsive to innovation? I mean, when you take a look at the headlines and see something bad happen in the markets that they supervise, I mean, they suffer from a lot of 20/20 hindsight, Monday morning quarterbacking from the public at large. That doesn't seem to kind of incentivize them to be more risk-taking. It seems to promote risk-averseness. So is there anything we can do to kind of promote more innovation and risk-taking on the part of the agencies?
Well, I would certainly say that government regulation by general is risk adverse. They have a headline risk concern that somehow they were not in charge in the right way. You see it at the FDA, you see it in financial regulation. They were in charge in 2008 and they didn't seem to take any of the blame for that. But I think sometimes we're too hard on them at the same time. Look at the last 25 years of moving to the internet from authentic signatures, PDF documentation, sharing files with government regulators before the cloud by uploading by VPN to streamline examination procedures. And all that, I think they've adapted pretty well. And then we go to mobile, and we pretty easily in this country adapted online payments and mobile deposit imaging, and so we really have innovated, and they've come along with that process. But in many instances, the internet just provided an electronic means of an analog activity. We didn't disrupt the flow. We still have 246 pages. It's now a PDF. I signed my name 1,000 times to get my home equity loan. And instead of carting it over to the office, I signed all that, imaged it, and put it in a PDF to somebody. But, you know, agency costs were reduced. Cost of closing was reduced. Consumer happiness went up. But now we're talking about, in the third wave, Steve Case's third wave, a disruptive process of that. And regulators will be under pressure to go from just redocumenting an analog activity differently to a wholly different digital approach. So if you're running a regulatory agency, they need a czar in that agency that's looking at that kind of cutting edge technology and how regulation needs to take advantage of it to streamline their own operation, but also be sensitive to how not to impede commercial progress in our global society. And that's been proposed in Congress before. You've heard that. And I don't think it's a frivolous idea to have a czar, a think person in this area, this disruptive area, in each of the regulatory agencies, and they should meet together to share ideas.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Congressman.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Let me bring up our next panel. Let me introduce Troy Paredes, the moderator. Troy, many of you know, was SEC Commissioner from 2008 to 2013. He's currently founder of Paredes Strategies, LLC, where he advises on financial regulations, compliance, risk management, corporate governance, governmental issues. And he also co-hosts a podcast on FinTech called Appetite for Disruption. Something you learn something new every day. Didn't know you had a podcast. All right, welcome aboard.
All right, well, we're getting mic'd up. I'll go ahead and start with a few brief introductions, maybe take a minute to set the stage and then jump in. I'm going to swing this around so I can see everybody a little bit better. The other thing, too, is to the extent folks have questions, we'll certainly try to reserve some time at the end. But if there are questions, raise your hand, and I'm sure somebody can bring around a mic. My general view is for the panelists to have the chance to be as responsive as possible to, as well as myself, to what's on everybody's mind. So quickly with the intros. We have Kristen Spradley from On Deck. Kristen is head of external affairs and associate general counsel at On Deck, where she leads federal and state legal and advocacy efforts. We have Andrew Navarrete, Capital One. Andy is the executive vice president of external affairs at Capital One Financial Corporation, where he oversees Capital One strategic and supervisory engagements with federal and state regulatory agencies and legislators, and leads the company's engagement in the communities that they serve at Capital One. And Steve Baums from Elan Advocacy. Steve is the president of the firm, which is a FinTech and financial services advocacy firm. And he has 15 years of experience working inside government, financial services companies, and the FinTech industry. A couple of just very quick things that I think will set the stage and maybe get the juices flowing here a bit. What I thought was interesting listening to Congressman McHenry and Congressman Hill in terms of their thoughts is, frankly, just how much cool stuff's going on. And, you know, the reference was to flyover country. As somebody who spent a number of years in St. Louis at WashU teaching, it's just great to see and hear all the stuff that's going on. I think so often we center around New York and DC and maybe Silicon Valley, but there's a big country out there with an incredible amount of talent. So I just found that to be, frankly, very encouraging and just terrific to hear. And in terms of mindset, I think that's another really important thing to keep in mind, and I'll be curious to hear others' views on this. You know, so often the debates and the discussions are about fine details of some regulatory provision. And that can lead things to get bogged down. But if you take a step back and say, are we all thinking about this the right way? And if you get that right mindset and the right approach in terms of what you should be striving for, all of a sudden some of the things that seem like differences can start to resolve themselves, and you can make real progress. And then the other quick thing, and then we'll turn over to the panelists, is with any change are going to come some difficulties and bumps along the way. And so as the congressman was talking about on the last discussion with Tom, some of the things that he thinks should happen, I just had pop in my mind the old saying of, you shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And so one of the things that I think is important too is as there are innovations, as those innovations get adapted, it's not going to be perfect. Again, there will be bumps. Some things won't go exactly the way we want them to go, but my caution would be that doesn't spur some sort of overreaction and therefore we start to shut things down. Because if you do that, what you're now going to do is give up all the benefit that was on the horizon. And when you give up the benefit on the horizon, well, society is not going to be as well off as it could have been. And that's really, I think, from my perspective, the stakes point that's important to keep in mind. So with that to kind of frame the discussion, let me start with Andy. So a lot of hype around FinTech. We're at a conference called FinTech, a lot of different dimensions to it. But one of the realities is whether it's in the financial services sector or other sectors, there's been a lot of tech for a long time. Right? There's always been a lot of innovation. There's a lot of things that now are kind of commonplace, ATMs and otherwise, that back in the day were, frankly, FinTech. So as you do what you do and you talk to the folks at the firm and you engage with folks like the folks in this room, hype, is it more of the same? Is it revolution, evolution? How would you kind of situate where we are now versus the kind of technological change and innovation we've actually been seeing from the very beginning, for that matter?
Troy, look, I think it's a great question, and one, thank you for hosting this panel, and thank you to David and Kate and Tom and the Chamber for hosting the conference. Tom, David and I were just joking a little bit about the name FinTech and the notion that we are somehow in this completely new paradigm or ecosystem. And look, I think you've hit upon something important, which is that the entire history of financial services has been one of innovation. From the beginning, it's starting with paper currency, or even the notion of lending. These things go back hundreds of years in this country, millennia, if you think about it at a global level. And so, when we think about FinTech and when we think about, where we are today in the marketplace, I would see it as revolutionary in terms of the kinds of technology we now have access to and can deploy to better serve our customers. But it's also evolutionary in the sense that it carries forward, I think, a long-standing tradition. The notion of a FinTech, I think when people sort of think traditionally about what a FinTech is, it's a market-funded, non-bank company that is, focused on a particular, perhaps product or niche segment of the marketplace, oftentimes working through technology and data without the benefit of physical presence. I started working for a company like that in 1999 called Capital One. That was, in fact, our business model back in the day. And what we found over time is that if you are going to sustain the ability to compete in the marketplace, you have to think more broadly about what tools are available to you and what elements of your risk profile you have to take care of. The fact is that the vast majority of FinTech-like competitors, they called them monolines back in the day, all of them failed. And Capital One is actually one of the few that did not. And part of that was actually embracing regulation, becoming a full-service bank, shoring up our liquidity, shoring up our capital, looking at the marketplace in a very, very different way, and looking at our place within the ecosystem to see how we survive over the longer term. So, look, I think you have sort of hit upon the big thematic element that this really is very much part and parcel of a historical trend that has occurred over time. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look for the revolutionary in where we are.
So is there a good concrete example of something that you all are doing that maybe on the revolutionary side of things?
Sure. I mean, when folks think about, there's oftentimes, I think, this perception that, the last great bank innovation was the ATM, back in the 70s, and kudos to Citi for coming up with that one. But the fact is, when you actually think about how you interact with bank, I have an intern with me today, 19 years old, and when we said 7 bank branch visits in a year, Kate, I agree with you, that sounds high. I think my number is 0. His is certainly 0. And the fact is, when you think about how he interacts with money, I mean, whether that be through, through apps that, allow him to move money among friends, when you think about, how he, deposits his paycheck, or are you getting a paycheck? I don't know. Okay, a small one, right? You think about, we just interact fundamentally different with money today. I don't know how many people have fraud alerts that they get in real time, right? A bunch of you. Every time my 14-year-old daughter goes on Amazon, I know it. And I will send then the communication to my wife instantaneously that says legit ? And that happens multiple times a day. But those are things or whatever that we now take for granted. But when you think about how, we used to do this, you had to wait for your paper statement at the end of the month to know, and then reconcile that with your checkbook and make sure whatever all the money that's flowing in and out is doing so in the way that you intended. All of that now happens in real time. All of that happens with artificial intelligence, machine learning, that can be deployed against fraud detection, against providing better services. So, look, I think there's a lot of innovation going on right now that is very exciting and very important to the lives of our consumers.
Yeah, terrific. So, Christian, so you work at OnDeck, a classic FinTech company. I think if people were to say, what's a FinTech company? They'd look to OnDeck. So one of the questions, or one of the things that I think often comes up is as if FinTech means early stage startup, notwithstanding everything Andy just said, and that you have more established enterprises and they're doing something else. Not to say they aren't tech heavy, but it's something different than FinTech. I don't think personally that's the right way to think about it. There's a lot of technology and innovation and fascinating things going on across all different sizes of companies in different sectors. So as you've been in this space, do you see, is it cooperation, competition, the word folks like to use, coopetition, is it head-to-head? How do you kind of see that landscape from the vantage point of where you are?
Yeah, so I mean, I think when companies first emerged, like OnDeck and other FinTech companies, I think that the buzzword was disruption, right? It was all about disrupting the existing system. And I don't think it comes as a surprise. A lot of FinTech companies got their start either during the financial crisis or recently thereafter. And I think a lot of us emerged because we started to try and target populations that we thought were being underserved by some sort of traditional credit market. So I think early stages, it was all about going it alone. And then I think with a decade of lending under our belt now at this point, we realized there's some real challenges to going it alone. And I think at the same time that we were working on maturing, a lot of traditional financial institutions were sort of taking a back seat and saying, let's just wait and see. Like, are these fly-by-night operations? Are they still going to be around in 2 or 3 years? And I think now, as companies have matured, you're seeing more and more moving away from disruption into like collaboration or into partnerships. And I think the reason these work so well is because it's mutually beneficial to both sides, right? Like, banks come in with a certain set of strengths and fintechs come in with a certain set of strengths, and they've been able to marry those really well. Banks come in with, a robust customer network, an immense amount of resources. They have an enviable cost of funds with their insured deposit base. There's just a lot of things that fintechs don't have access to. But at the same time, we're coming to the table with cutting edge technology, with really innovative either underwriting or servicing platforms, and then also, frankly, with kind of an operational nimbleness that I think a lot of banks have lost. And I think those partnerships together are changing the way that people are accessing financial services. And like one great example, just speaking on behalf of OnDeck, is we have a partnership with JP Chase, where essentially we offer our decisioning and our servicing platform almost as a SaaS service. And I think it's a great example of how those things can be mirrored well, because we're able to speed up the funding process and use our technology to help JP Chase deploy capital in a way that they're getting a decision in minutes and they're getting funded in 24 hours. That used to be only a dream for a small business, and it also takes advantage of their existing customer network to help deliver their product better and faster. I think that's kind of the wave of the future. I think both sides have realized going it alone in either case is probably not tenable.
So when you are going it alone and you're a startup and you're earlier on in your growth, you mentioned some of the challenges. 1 or 2 particular challenges that sticks out. I mean, the one that was mentioned already today is some of the compliance and regulatory challenges, which is to identify compliance and regulation as a challenge is not to say one doesn't take compliance seriously and the need for there to be sound regulation. It's just to recognize the reality that it can be challenging, it can be complicated, it can be time consuming, it can take you away from other efforts about investing in the business, and so how do you manage all of that? So that's one that would, I'm sure, obviously come to mind, but are there other things that you all experienced as a go-it-alone before you had this partnership and got a little more mature that were particularly difficult?
I mean, I think Congressman Hill touched on a lot of those points, and I would just like to give a little shout out as another proud Arkansan. We don't get our moment in the sun very often, especially in FinTech conversations. So, but I think regulatory burdens have been a huge issue, not just for OnDeck, but for a lot of FinTechs. None of us are chartered banks, and so that kind of creates this hybrid scenario where we're kind of a creature of state law, and we're working under 50 different states worth of regimes on things like privacy, on cybersecurity, on lending and licensing laws, and it's tough to manage all of those regimes. But the overlay also of not only the 50 states worth of regulations, but also federal lending laws that apply equally to sort of banks and non-banks. And then OnDeck in particular is a public company, so we also are complying with securities laws. And I think all of those for an organization that starts as sort of people running around the office on scooters and bringing their dogs in, like understanding things like KYC and AML laws and sanction screening, that's a lot to wrap your head around if you're sort of a serial entrepreneur. I think when you realize that you're not just dealing with technology, which is heavily regulated, but also financial services, and then the combination of the two is kind of a sum that's greater than its parts.
So that's a perfect segue, Steve. So all of that and other things leads to the question of, all right, so what ought to be done? And how do you go about thinking about it, going back to Congressman McHenry's points to open the morning. So in terms of the current policy framework, in terms of the regulatory framework that flows from the policy choices that get made, what do you see from your perspective are opportunities for improvement, whether it's in terms of mindset or in terms of some of the particular things that you think really would have big bang for your buck in terms of addressing some of the challenges?
Yeah, sure. So let me maybe start with the broader question first and give a specific answer second. The broader, I think, perspective from the FinTech community is a cultural shift at the regulatory agencies. There was a question before about incentives from regulators and perhaps a disincentive for innovation versus protectionism. I think there's some truth to that. We have at many, maybe most now, of the federal regulatory agencies and throughout the various states, quite a few as well, chief innovation officers, innovation offices, who are tasked within their agency with driving forward innovative ideas, in some states, sandboxes. And that's great, but they need to be empowered, and they need to have the ability to have equal footing with their safety and soundness counterparts, with their examination counterparts, enforcement counterparts, to really drive a change in the way that regulators think about innovation for the better of consumers and small businesses. The second and a more specific issue, which sounds like a pretty easy talking point, but when you drive into it gets really complicated very quickly, is data and consumers' data. There is no clear answer in the US with regards to the data that I generate as a customer of a financial institution, as a broker-dealer, whether it's mine, whether it belongs to my financial institution, some combination of the two. If they apply analytics to it, is that theirs, is that mine? Whereas you look at some other geographies around the world, Europe is one that we've talked about quite a bit, the UK, that answer has been decided. And not just from a privacy perspective, but from an empowerment perspective. It's really complex, right? There's a bunch of issues that are embedded in that. There's obviously security issues that are embedded in that. There's privacy issues embedded in that. There's technology issues embedded in that. How does a financial institution make that data available to third parties and to you as the consumer through the third party you want to use? And it's particularly difficult in the US market because we have the regulatory fragmentation we've been talking about, but also because we have a really complex, diverse financial market with a really long tail of smaller financial institutions that maybe don't have the resources or the will to build technology platforms the way that larger financial institutions do. So data is where I would start, and I'm sure we'll talk about kind of the international regime, but figuring out how the ownership of the data works from all of those perspectives is where I would recommend we start.
So once again, I'll invite folks, if they have questions, don't be hesitant to raise your hand, and we'll get to you. But in the meanwhile, as you all think of your questions, to pick up on what you were saying, and again, I think it's been a theme throughout the day, the need for the regulatory environment to keep pace in one way or another, which is not to say to jettison underpinning principles, it's not to say to have a wholesale rewrite, but it is to say to make sure that everything fits so that you have a regulatory environment that keeps pace insofar as it doesn't stifle in untoward and inappropriate ways innovation that's going to make us better off, right? At least from my perspective, an overarching consideration. It's also the case, and I think your remarks speak to this, where if you're a policymaker, a regulator, that you're trying to wrap your arms around the ways in which things are changing so you can then make smart decisions about the right regulatory response. Don't go too fast, don't do too much, don't too little, don't go too slow. That's difficult, and I think particularly difficult where you have the pace of change from a technology perspective and innovation perspective being what it is. Again, you think about, as Congressman Hill talked about, in terms of the wide impacts and potential for blockchain. Every day you read another story about another use case or application of blockchain, and these things are just continuing to move. And if you're on deck maybe a handful of years ago in particular, for the regulator to say, well, we'll get back to you on that, but it's going to take 6 months for us to get back to you, I'm sure you sit back and say, well, we don't got 6 months, guys.
That's a lifetime.
That's a lifetime, and it can be a real lifetime if you're really early stage and your funding is about to run out. That's true lifetime, because you simply may not have the funding to get to 6 months. So 3 months may be all you have before you have to close up shop. So in light of all of that, advice for how regulators can wrap their arms around, get themselves in a position where they feel as though they're prepared to make the judgments. Some of those may be bigger picture, some of those may be really fine refinements to the regulatory process, but that nonetheless could be helpful. I think credit to the Chamber for flagging a lot of this in what really is a terrific report that this event is really about as well. So that's the big wind-up, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'll throw it open to everybody.
Sure. Maybe you can start, and it might be helpful, I mean, for context purposes, maybe to take a little bit of a step back. I alluded to in my opening comments in terms of talking a little bit about the history of Capital One, that this, may sound heretical, but that we actually embraced regulation and became a full-service bank by choice, as opposed to that just sort of being either one, our origin story, or two, a conscious decision to sort of stay in more of the fintech space of being, largely state-regulated without a lot of federal oversight. There was a very concrete and very rational reason why we did that, which is the vast majority of non-bank financial companies will ultimately fail, not because of technology, not because of bad ideas, but because of a lack of funding. And when you are dependent on the public markets and the capital markets for funding, look, that can be an incredible accelerant to growth. It can be an incredible tool for enabling the creation of a company. But sustaining that over time, especially if investors are fickle, can be a dangerous game and can be a very, very difficult road to hoe. For us as a financial institution, when we got to a certain level and to a certain scale, we understood the benefits of deposit funding, for example, the stability that creates. But there is a massive trade-off, a quid pro quo for that choice, which is to subject yourself to 24/7 supervision, to very, very strict controls over your practices and over what kinds of business lines you can and can't get into, and then ultimately to capital and liquidity standards that are considerably higher than a non-bank has to face. And so the reason I sort of share that context is because as we talk on the margins about what kind of regulation ought to apply or ought not to apply to the non-bank segment of the marketplace, oftentimes people sort of talk about the benefits banks get of having a uniform set of federal standards rather than having to comply with 50 sets of laws. Well, that came with a choice and it came with a trade-off. Now, getting to Troy, the core question you were asking, I do think there is quite a bit regulators can do to enable more innovation. both for the banking and the non-banking segment of the marketplace, which I think coexist in this ecosystem and are both necessary to making sure that innovation is allowed to flourish and that customers ultimately benefit from that. And you know, I think I would start with this notion of, you know, first the mindset shift that Congressman McHenry alluded to. I think we're starting to see it. You have an Office of Innovation that has been built within the OCC under Beth Knickerbocker, and I think they're looking to do a lot of great work. Director Mulvaney was in here a couple of weeks ago at the Chamber. The only thing he has created at the BCFP is actually an Office of Innovation. His other work has been focused on streamlining much of that organization. So it shows you that there is still a passionate commitment there to enabling innovation. I think those are places to start, but I think what regulators have to contend with is a very entrenched culture that exists within the legal divisions, within the supervisory regimes, within the examiner population that is out there in the field. You have to educate and tackle all of the dimensions of that, because that's usually where the pain points are actually felt. You know, in convincing an examiner in the field who is in your institution, who doesn't come to conferences like this, who may not have all of the context necessary to make the right decisions. Those are the places where we actually have to focus attention, and where leadership within the agencies has to focus their attention in order to allow those folks to be more comfortable incentivizing them to enable more innovation.
Kristen, Steve?
Yeah, I would just jump in. I think that there's sort of two prominent models that have emerged for a lot of different fintech companies. And I think that there's things that regulators can do and are doing now for both of those models. So one of the common models is a lot of fintechs will partner with major banks, maybe as a credit sponsor or an issuing bank sponsor or some sort of white label solution. And I think the exciting thing that we've seen there, but where there is still room for improvement, has been guidance on how those banks are going to kind of oversee the company that's providing some sort of vendor or technology services. And we've seen some, very robust guidance come out of the FDIC. So for those of us who partner with FDIC banks, we're sort of subject to almost like an indirect, level of supervision from a federal banking regulator. Same thing if you partner with an OCC bank. So I think continuing to kind of streamline those, because if you partner with more than one bank, you're essentially going through 2 or 3 or 4 full-scale audits that are frankly very repetitious. I don't know that it's adding any value for either the bank or the fintech to kind of complete those year after year over and over and over again, asking the same sets of questions. So I think that's where I see there being some opportunities for regulators on kind of the bank partnership model. A number of other fintechs have engaged in direct lending or in some sort of other, direct payment transfer services. And I think for them, we're also seeing some kind of equally exciting developments, both in terms of the, potential limited purpose fintech charter. I think is still an option. We're kind of waiting to hear what the details on that will be. But hopefully by the end of this month, we'll know if that's a viable option for some fintechs to kind of seek that regulatory certainty themselves. And at the same time, to give the states some credit, there's also the CSBS has been doing a program, part of their Vision 2020, and they have a fintech advisory panel that includes a lot of the companies that I see here in this room today, where they're looking at ways to make sort of a streamlined, multi-state, reciprocal model that works across the states, so that if you don't choose or elect to do a national charter, you still have some of that certainty and some of those efficiencies at the state level, where sharing supervisory roles, sharing exam results, moving people away from paper onto like an NMLS system. And I think all of those would be huge step forward and very much kind of speaks the language of a fintech. Like, let's streamline this, let's aggregate, like let's automate. That's exactly what we came about to do. So almost kind of and I think Congressman Hill touched on this point but didn't call it this, but RegTech, using technology to improve the regulators' process as well as the actual companies that they're regulating.
Yeah. Steve?
So a couple of additional thoughts. The first is, I was talking about culture with the regulators. If you look at the places around the world where the regulators have been more forward-thinking, it's much less fragmented, as you've heard from a number of folks. Here, as I said, we have, I think, 7 federal regulators with some piece of this. So in a world where this is not bifurcated, this is septuplicated, coordination amongst the various regulators is key, right? And that's a great starting point. I think there's been quite a bit of that over the last couple of years, but there's still progress that can be made there. The other thing I would say is this isn't happening in a vacuum. The US is not the only country to be thinking about this. There are, to steal the term, there are regulatory sandboxes for the regulators. The regulators in the US can look to Europe, can look to the UK, can look to Singapore, to South Africa, to Australia, to Canada, a number of other geographies and governments that are in the process of implementing more prescriptive regimes around how fintech should work. In the UK, for example, open banking went live on the 13th of January this year, along with PSD2. Australia will have its own regime up and running within the next 12 to 18 months. That's not to say we just take those regimes and build them here, but that is to say those are useful tests that the regulators can look to and take lessons learned from those to figure out how best to tailor some of those regimes here in the US.
Is there something that you've seen in some of those other countries when it comes to the sandboxes or approaches where you say, taking your point, right? Just because it works there doesn't mean it's going to work here. You got to put it in its kind of overall context and see how it's going to fit. But having said that, things that you've seen other countries do where you say, yeah, that's something we really ought to take seriously and see if we can't adapt that.
Open banking for sure. So open banking is this notion that if you're providing financial services to a consumer, to a small business, whether you're a bank or a fintech, you should be regulated. And there should be certain protections that you must adhere to. You must make the consumer whole if there's some type of fraudulent activity and that costs the consumer money. But on the other side of the spectrum, the data belongs to the consumer, and the consumer is able to use whatever regulated, approved third party they choose. This is in early days. The UK set it up, as I said, in January, but it's spreading like wildfire. So Canada, the government budget this year requires the finance ministry to put out a study on whether or not to do this. Spoiler alert, they're probably going to do it. In Australia, like I said, it will come on board within the next 12 to 18 months, a bunch of other countries. The UK view is open banking, which for now is just going to connect your current account, your checking account, and your transaction information, is a stepping stone towards pensions, towards healthcare, towards an open data ecosystem for consumers across the spectrum of their lives, not just financial, all of it. And that you, as a consumer, get to do two things. You get to control your data and use it with whatever party you want, be it a healthcare provider, a bank, a non-bank, whomever. But it also means that you are protected, and you know that you have those protections, and that if something goes wrong, you know precisely to pick up the phone, send a tweet to, whatever, to make sure that that problem is solved in as expeditious a way as possible. And it's that balance, I think, that we're striving for here. It's much tougher here, bigger market, more fragmentation, but that's where I think the promise of this open data ecosystem really lies.
So one of the things that I think in discussions like this, I think we all intellectually know that innovation is a good thing. What can be challenging is, I think sometimes, because all the innovations we've experienced now, in some instances, just become commonplace everyday life, and we can't even remember what life was like before we were doing the things we do, right, where we get the benefit of the innovation. So all that is to get to this question, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Do you think that there's really a keen enough appreciation of intangible, concrete ways, the way the kind of innovation that we're talking about and alluding to actually makes our daily lives better, particularly when it comes to financial services? So to frame that just a little more pointedly, as you think about the things that you've done, your clients or your companies, you think about the things that are being whiteboarded probably as we speak. Are there one or two examples you can give as to how it just flat out makes our lives better? Because I do think that that's an important part of the mindset notion in terms of really making tangible and concrete what's at stake. What's at stake if we get this right in terms of the benefits that we are going to enjoy? And the flip side of that is what's at stake if we get it wrong in terms of the benefits that we're not going to have that actually do in fact or would in fact make our lives better?
It's a great question, and gets back to this notion of making sure that we always understand the context in which we are operating in and just how vastly different the world is today versus the one that we grew up in. There's I think it's Jim Gaffigan or some comedian who does this great bit about how people, you get on an airplane and you complain about the shoddy Wi-Fi. Can you just step back and think, you can now use a smartphone on an airplane. It's just sort of crazy, but we lose the appreciation for the innovation very, very, very quickly. I think about even something, not surprisingly, that I would mention a credit card, but a credit card, is a 3-inch piece of plastic or whatever that serves as a universal currency. I traveled a lot, Europe last year with my family, literally did not bring cash. Never used it, never needed it. That's just extraordinary, right? I now no longer even need the 3-inch piece of plastic because it's embedded as a payment mechanism within my phone. And so, the notion that you no longer have to go to currency exchanges, pay exorbitant fees, right? I can do remote deposit capture and take out the one reason I might actually go to a bank branch. It's really just, we're in a world now, with the real-time fraud alerts, with the ability to communicate with chatbots and other features, again, in real time, rather than sitting on a customer service line and punching through a variety of different prompts to get to somebody to actually address your problem. And so, I do think we are in a remarkably different world. This gets back at this notion of appropriate regulation, right? Look, regulation ought to exist to ensure safety and soundness. It ought to exist to ensure integrity. It ought to exist to make sure that there are data protection standards that protect consumers. What it should not exist to do is to get in the way of innovations that are clearly consumer friendly, but that won't challenge the safety and soundness or the integrity of the system, right? If we want to deliver a new app, if we want to deliver a new product or service, this is the mindset shift I would like to see in the regulatory agencies. One is, starting with a sense of materiality. Right? Is this going to sink the institution if we get it wrong? Look, if our app stinks, our consumers will let us know that. The bank is not going to fail as a result of that, right? So allow us to experiment, allow us to tinker with it and deliver it in a way that ultimately may produce massive consumer benefits. And if things go wrong, we can fix those and the market can take care of itself. So I think that sense of materiality of where regulators ought to step in and where they shouldn't step in, I think is critical. I'll make one other point because picking up on something Steve said, yes, we do have the most Byzantine regulatory system in the world. It is a product of 200 years of historical accident, not one of design. But I'm not going to let the regulators off the hook because each one of them is individuals, whether it be the OCC or the BCFP or the Fed, can actually make mindset shifts within their agencies to enable exactly what I'm talking about. And that doesn't actually require some massive pie-in-the-sky kind of coordination. So they do have the power to make a difference.
Kristen?
Yeah, I think one thing that we haven't touched on yet, that taking a big step back, when you sort of ask, like, what tangible good is this doing? I think certainly there's something to be said about FinTech advancements that make the system run more smoothly, faster, or better for existing customers. But I think one really critical piece of a lot of our missions is not just serving better the customers that are already in the system, but using and realizing technology for financial inclusion. And I think that a lot of the actions that we've been taking reach populations of folks, particularly when we serve small businesses. There's a whole lot of small businesses that do not have the ability to borrow in any sort of traditional credit market. And I think that not only are we making it faster to deposit a check or easier to do something on the fly or on the run, we're also fundamentally reaching a population of folks who are just not engaged in kind of your brick and mortar banking. And I think those kinds of step forwards to me are the ones that are the most exciting. The ability to use new data in your underwriting systems to reach people with thin credit files. Think of like a recent immigrant, a woman or minority owned business or veteran owned businesses. All of these populations that have just for a very long time, with the best of intentions, I feel like traditional banks have struggled to be able to serve these populations, either because it's economically unviable, because of compliance, cost, like you name it. And I think that the ability of technology to not just improve the existing system, but really bring in a whole new group of people into the system is what excites me the most. And when you hear stats like Congressman McHenry mentioned all of the different branch closings, There's a whole population of folks who need to drive 20, 30, 40, 50 miles to get to their closest bank branch. Guess what you don't have to do if you can access your bank on an app? And I think that, in addition to reaching millennials who've gotten used to being able to use those services, I think that to me is like a tangible good. And I think it's probably helpful from a regulatory perspective to every once in a while take a step back and say, are there risks? Yes. Do those risks need to be managed and mitigated? Yes. But there are real rewards. And those, I think, need to be weighed against it. And every time that you move forward with a particular regulation, whether it's implementing it or rolling it back, think who stands to benefit and who am I really trying to protect here and from what?
Give Steve a chance at the question, but again, if anybody has any questions from the audience, just let us know.
And just to tie those two things together, so Andy mentioned the idea of taking a step back. So let's take a step back, right? Let's take ourselves out of this room and to the rest of the country where we know the state of consumer finances are pretty dismal. The average American doesn't have any meaningful retirement savings. About 45% of Americans can't afford a surprise $400 expense. Right up there with health, finances are the #1 thing that keep most Americans up at night. It's a very stress-inducing thing for most people, and it's very intimidating for most people to navigate their financial lives. And so when you think about easing access to the financial system, creating a better user experience of the financial system, and this, by the way, isn't meant to say that it's just non-incumbents who are doing it. This is incumbent players who have been in the market for, in some cases, centuries. That's a huge benefit. And there's a ton of stats that back it up. So as one example, the simplest form of FinTech, or the simplest use case of FinTech, is something like a mint.com. So the notion of seeing everything you have in one place, track all of your assets, all of your liabilities, and all of your transactions. With that, you can set a budget, you can start saving. Personal Capital, which is a FinTech firm, did a study on this and found that within 3 months of using that type of aggregation app, their average customer spent 15% less on a monthly basis, just because they could see it all in one place. And the average American has around 15 different financial accounts with somewhere between 7 and 8 financial institutions, which sounds like a lot until you start thinking about your own financial life. And maybe you have a mortgage, student loans, credit cards, checking account, savings account, investment account. You've had a couple of jobs, so different retirement accounts. How do you track that as somebody who's not financially savvy? And that's just kind of the baseline app that most people use. So I think it's a very tangible benefit to the vast majority of people. And then that doesn't even get into the more kind of novel use cases.
Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Julia Zaghi. I'm an intern here at the Chamber, but for Congressional and Public Affairs. I know we've been talking. Hi, I know we've been talking a lot about FinTech and how it relates to consumers, but I'm interested to know how FinTech can be used to predict fluctuations in the economy in your professional experience.
Interesting. It's a good question. So this all gets back to data, right? So if one assumes that a FinTech or a firm in the FinTech space has access to data with a big enough kind of representation of the market, you can start to see things that are happening in that market and start to make predictions about what might happen. So as one example, if you're a financial aggregator that's helping to connect people to their financial accounts to third parties, you can compare, for example, the average mortgage payment in a state or in a zip code from one quarter to the same quarter the following year and start to see if people are over-leveraging themselves in terms of their mortgages. So you can start to make some predictive make some predictive analysis of what may happen, but you have to be very careful, right? Because nobody has the same line of sight as the regulators do into the totality of the economy. And so when you're, as a FinTech, you have kind of a narrow slice of that market. And so you have to be careful when you make those jumps to saying, here's what we're seeing, therefore this must be happening in the entire market. But there's potential there, for sure.
Yeah, let me, there's a good caution in that question. And so, it's no coincidence that the Googles, the Facebooks, you can pay through Messenger, right? There's Google Pay, there's Apple Pay. You kind of have to wonder sometimes, so if you're looking at that marketplace, and like, why would they build all this infrastructure to offer these services for free? And the question is, or the answer to that is actually relatively self-evident because transaction data is incredibly powerful. and useful and is desirable for these companies that are looking to amass as much data as they can about our behaviors. And so the question of how that data is gathered, how that data is protected is something that we've talked quite a bit about up here. The other question you have to ask yourself is, how is that data used? Now, if it's used for some kind of economic research, okay, that's under the right parameters, that could be fine. If it's used for more nefarious purposes, right? If it's being, sold to hedge funds, if it's being, used or whatever for people trying to, corner a particular market or to, outperform in the securities space, right? There's all sorts of different ways that could be used, I think, that are, probably outside the scope of what we would think is appropriate. So, I would just say that, when you think about the data issue, think about data protection, but also think about data usage. And that's a big part of, when we develop relationships with aggregators, for example, or with these third parties, we want to make sure that they have the right protocols in place to make sure that that data is not hacked. But we also care very deeply about how they're using it, and we want to make sure that we stay very, very much focused on what is to the benefit of the individual consumer, not necessarily to the benefit of other parties who may have, like I said, very different purposes for wanting and using that information.
Picking up super quickly on Andy's point about the use of the data, one thing I think that it could really add is, so if you think about, let's say a decade ago, if you were, and we only serve small businesses, so we have a really unique perspective, because I think we're looking at the health of American businesses, which can be a great kind of canary in the coal mine for where the broader economy might be going. But if you were going to underwrite a small business loan a decade ago, you would look at their tax returns from last year. That could be 7, 8, 9 months stale by the time you're looking at it. And I think one thing that you're seeing a lot of really innovative, like algorithmic work being done, is to look at real-time data. And so instead of looking at something that may be from last year and trying to guess if the business is still doing about the same, we're now able to say, let's see your bank statements for the last 3 months. How much money is coming in? How much money is going out? And that's as of the moment that you're underwriting. And I think that kind of real-time finger on the pulse is really changing the predictability of a lot of both the underwriting, but then once you've made a loan and you're servicing it and it's living out its life in the loan cycle, I think we also have very quick and easy indicators. We're not waiting for payments every month or every quarter. So we know if somebody starts to fall behind, we'll know that in a week. And we'll be able to reach out to them and kind of proactively engage in these conversations with people. And I think that's a real benefit of technology when it comes to kind of predictive economic indicators, is that you're getting real-time information.
All right, we have 1 minute left, so I'm going to ask one last question. I'm going to actually direct it to Steve real quick, which is the international landscape, because you were talking about sandboxes and it came up in some of the earlier discussions. If the U.S. doesn't get it right, and people may disagree on what it means to get it right, but let's just kind of go with that. If the U.S. doesn't get it right in terms of the regulatory regime and having it calibrated appropriately, realizing the global nature of the marketplace, that capital credit can flow around, that people can actually move, et cetera, what do you think the consequences would be as a result?
So since we're in DC, I'll do my best to answer your question without actually answering your question. Look, it would be really sensationalist to say that would mean that the sky is going to fall and we would lose our edge in the market and everyone's going to move to Europe or to Singapore and do their business there. That heavily discounts the strength of the U.S. economy and the size of the U.S. economy and the innovation that takes place here, almost despite kind of the Byzantine regulatory structure that we have in many ways. But it is also true that you see a number of fintech firms starting in London. And it's not because the cost there is cheap or because there's certainty about the regulatory landscape in London or the UK versus Europe. And so there's a tremendous opportunity, I would say, to foster this innovation by getting it right, whatever right means. I do think there's a risk that we slip behind. I think that's probably been a little bit sensationalized given the strength of the economy here. But there's also, I think we have to look at the upside, not just the downside.
All right, well, on that note, it's always good to look at the upside and not just the downside. Why don't you join me in thanking the panelists for the discussion.
last panel, so want to do a bit of a deep dive on one of my favorite buzziest of buzzwords, cryptocurrency. And I think we'll also get into the blockchain space. So let me introduce Peter Van Valkenburg from Coin Center. He's the director of research there. And frankly, I saw him speak at a conference and my mind was blown a little bit. And so I just wanted to have a bit of a chat with him, and please do ask questions at the end. I kept asking him a million things because he's been so active in this space from the absolute beginning. So let's dive right in. So there has been, as I mentioned, a lot of buzzwords regarding cryptocurrency, FinTech. What are some of the common myths that you would like to dispel?
Sure. So, and thanks for having me, Kate, and thanks for setting expectations really high with that introduction.
No pressure.
And a little bit about Coin Center real briefly. We're a nonprofit based here in Washington, D.C. that is not an industry association. It's more of just an independent research organization focused on these technologies, open blockchain technologies in general. As far as myths that we run into a lot that we really would like to dispel, there's two big ones. The first is that these things, especially cryptocurrencies, but maybe open blockchain networks and the tokens associated with them in general, are nothing more than money used by criminals on the internet and this is kind of the same thing, Ponzi-like investment schemes that really have no fundamentals behind them. These are things you'll see in the headlines all the time. It's sensible that this is something that people would grab a hold of. These are sexy headlines. And there is, make no mistake, tons of fraud and criminal use of these things. I just want to be clear. But these criticisms mirror rather one-to-one the criticisms of the early internet. And this is why. The early internet was a permissionless network. It allowed anybody to use it. Anybody could start a website. Didn't matter if you were someone living in a totalitarian regime and you wanted to create a blog and speak against the people at the top. Didn't matter if you wanted to start a business with a website and everybody thought your idea was crazy, like selling books on through the mail on the internet, or creating an informal taxi cab service. You know, it didn't matter that normally with gatekeepers, your idea would be prohibited or unable to flourish. You could just do it. But the fact was, the early internet was permissionless also for criminals. It was permissionless also for porn. It was permissionless also for fraud. And so a lot of the early adopters tended to be those less desirable folks. And yet it was the permissionless nature for those innovating individuals that really made the internet the massive force for economic growth we see today. Open blockchain networks are permissionless in the same way that the early internet is. And so, yes, you will see early adopters who are less reputable. But that openness is also exactly what will make people who we would have never thought to fund before able to build on this thing, able to leverage this open infrastructure and start something that otherwise wouldn't have gotten going. And that's, I think, why open blockchain networks will be the biggest force for economic growth on the planet since the internet. It's not here yet, and this is a slow burn. The hype about the price is a fast burn, you know, the bubbles and then the collapses, the bubbles and the collapses. But the general trend here, the real innovation here, which maybe we'll talk about in a second, is a slow burn and an important one.
Definitely. No, and I see a lot of those parallels. And I think, you know, with any new technology, it is kind of the cost-benefit analysis. And without the internet, I mean, yes, there is definitely bad actors on there, but can we imagine our life without it at this point? Absolutely not. I mean, I got here this morning with Uber. You know, it's like there's not taxi cabs in front of my house.
Lyft,
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there you go.
One or the other. Competition's good.
So what do you see are the real benefits of these new technologies, especially in the blockchain and crypto space?
Yeah. So specifically, open blockchain technologies is what I want to talk about, not the permissioned systems that are being developed, which probably could lower costs in the back office, but aren't the, I think, disruptive and truly formative innovation here. So I was thinking this morning about presenting this in a completely different way than I've ever talked about it before. So bear with me, hopefully this works. Show of hands, who's familiar with the distinction between bearer instruments and registered instruments? Good, so maybe this will be helpful then. So a bearer instrument is a thing like a $100 bill. Whoever holds it and shows up with it is owed the goods, if it's legal tender, or is able to use it as a means of payment. A registered asset is like the stocks you have in your TD America account or something like that. At the end of the day, the asset is held by a registry. It's held, in this case, it's a certificate often of some sort, although it's dematerialized, it's paperless, but it's held by an institution. And in this case, it's the DTCC here in the US. Now, the early economy flourished during the Industrial Revolution and during the formative years of America off of bearer instruments. They were efficient and great. You would actually trade stocks using bearer instruments. You would actually see a lot of cash transactions. But the problem with that is, of course, you have to be in person to exchange a bearer instrument. I need to be able to take the stock certificate and hand it to Kate, or the $100 bill. When we move to the 20th century and everything becomes electronic, we can do better than this. We could centralize the records of ownership about those assets in one building. And this gets back to Congressman McHenry's Tower versus the Square, which is a fascinating book that I need to look at because it's very similar to another book in our cryptocurrency culture called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. But it's another book. So the Tower is the organization that keeps the register. They're the DTCC, or they're the suite of financial intermediaries. So if the asset is cash-like or dollar-like instead of a stock certificate, it's not the DTCC that keeps the register, it's the number of banks in the Federal Reserve System and elsewhere. If you're using a credit card, you're using cash, but you're kind of using a registered instrument because it's the credit card issuing bank and the merchant acquiring bank and the switch provider, Visa or MasterCard, that are like this tower, this centralized repository for the information about ownership data, about who has assets, and facilitates the payments between people. So that's great, because now all those records are in one place, and we can have much more efficient exchange, and we can do it over long distance. I call up my person in the tower, and they talk to someone else in the tower, and then that person calls up someone else in the world. And we just trust the people in the tower to facilitate an exchange that could have never happened with bearer instruments because I'm in Hong Kong and you're in Washington, D.C. But there's problems with towers as compared to the square. The square is just people out there in the marketplace, or the bazaar in the other metaphor, cathedral bazaar. They're just people who are trying to engage in economic transactions, and because they meet in a sort of decentralized area, like a bunch of stalls where there's different merchants selling things, they can just interact. The data's there. The problem with the tower versus the bazaar is sort of twofold. One, there's a liability that they have all this data. It's a ton of data, and they could manage it, or they could choose to not offer services to people they don't see as lucrative customers, so you have an unbanked problem here, you have a financial inclusion problem here, you have a data protection problem here, you have a data integrity problem here. All of this stuff can get hacked, and it's increasingly getting hacked. And there's inefficiencies. You have to pay for the building of the tower. There was a certain efficiency, aside from the distance problem with bearer instruments. It just works. I hand you a $100 bill, and now you have it. Boom, settlement. It's great. You don't have to have multiple institutions reconciling books. So the real innovation, I know this is a little long-winded, the real innovation of cryptocurrencies and tokens and open blockchain networks is to allow us to have digital bearer instruments so that it can be a transaction between me in Singapore and you in Washington, D.C., long distance with no tower in between. Just person to person, just like the days of stock certificates that I could hand in person, just like the days of cash that I could hand in person. And there's no vulnerable choke point in the middle whatsoever with respect to getting hacked, with respect to refusing to take customers, with respect to keeping that data from the public view such that we can't learn things about it like systemic risk, such that we can't do academic research on that data. And how is this possible? Well, it's possible because of open blockchain networks where all of that ownership data is put out in the public. The Bitcoin blockchain is the full record of who owns what when it comes to Bitcoin. So it's kind of like a registered asset, not a bearer asset, because there is a register, but nobody owns the register. It's just this spreadsheet that is cumulatively maintained by people all over the world performing routinized tasks, the miners, the node runners. They're just running software. And that means that data is just there. Everyone can see it, everyone can analyze it for different purposes, and everyone can then take advantage of it and use it to build businesses, use it to build new tools and technologies. And it's not just money. So if you can turn a Bitcoin into if you can turn money into a bearer asset like Bitcoin, or maybe it's a stable coin, so maybe it won't have this crazy exchange rate and things like that. Or maybe it's even a government-issued digital currency where they control the supply, and so maybe can deal with inflation and things like that. But it's not just money, because you can turn other things into digital bearer assets. You could create a digital bearer mortgage, and this is actually really interesting. Because the other thing you can do with these digital assets, and now I'm really just...
No, just go for it.
So the other thing you can do with these digital assets, aside from allow them to be, peer-to-peer tradable, and the transactions don't go through the tower, they go through the square, the other thing you can do is make them programmatic, such that a person is actually paying the asset on the blockchain when they're paying their mortgage, and then that smart contract, and this is what we mean by smart contracts, is paying whoever currently has the bearer asset, the token. And you could bundle them in a smart contract. And you could, so you're disaggregating the entire business of mortgages by reviving bearer instruments, but making them digital, so peer-to-peer tradable, and making them programmatic, so they can deal with, say, a revenue flow and things like that. That's, I think, amazing. Yeah. But it's going to take time. So if I sound like a lunatic, this is not happening today or tomorrow. Right now, you can do a little of this. It's like a fun preview with something like Bitcoin or Ethereum. But there's all kinds of risks involved. And no, I don't think we should just, switch our global economy to this stuff right now. But I think it's coming just like the internet was coming in 1996.
So for those who aren't as familiar as kind of how this whole process works and all of that, because that could sound a little bit scary that all your finances are out there and, anyone can see it.
Right.
Is that the case, or do you need to have some sort of instrument to get into a certain block, and kind of how does that work?
So with Bitcoin, everything's out there in public. There's no human readable names in the Bitcoin blockchain, or any blockchains for that matter. They're pseudonyms, they're Bitcoin addresses or token addresses that look like a bunch of random numbers and letters, kind of like a bank account number. Mm-hmm. But the problem with that is, if somebody knows your particular unique number, and any cluster of numbers that you have a habit of using as payment addresses to receive payments or send payments, then they can look at the blockchain and draw a very high definition picture of your entire financial livelihood with respect to that particular asset. Mm-hmm. It's radical transparency. This is far more public than bank money. This is way more public than cash, which is real like dollars, which is basically truly anonymous. And this is another misconception that's worth dispelling, is this idea that Bitcoin is an anonymous cryptocurrency or an anonymous payment method. It's the most fully identified, transparent graph of transactions ever seen by man. Anybody with a computer and an internet connection could open right now, and if I gave you some addresses that I said were associated with me, you could see everything with my financial transactions. And if I wasn't going to cooperate, you could say, hey, Peter, let me send you some Bitcoin. And I'd say, okay, sure. I'd have to show you the address where I'm going to receive payment, and then you get it, and then you can do the full transaction graph analysis from that by linking that address to everyone else who's paid me. So this is a problem, and this is actually...
It could be scary for people who don't have the best financial health.
Right, or just in general for privacy and human dignity.
Yeah.
And our financial transactions are really...
Private for a reason, I think.
Exactly.
Yes.
So this is why we've seen the emergence of privacy-protecting cryptocurrencies. And these are things that also get a bad rap in the press, I'll say, things like Monero and Zcash. But these innovations are essential to making this system work. We can't have a fully transparent blockchain for all of our global financial transactions. It would be this sort of radical transparency that would just ruin everything, I think, for multiple reasons, either ideological but also practical from a business standpoint. And so these things get a bad rap because they do amazing things. So what these privacy-protecting cryptocurrencies actually allow you to do is to get blockchain verification of the integrity of the transaction. Yes, I know that this transaction was Peter sending cryptocurrency or a token that he had previously received, so he's not making up money, to somebody else. So you get that global verification of that transaction that you'd get from the Bitcoin blockchain, but you do it without having any other additional information about my past transaction history hemorrhaged in the process. And these things are called, and it's far too brief of a time period here to explain them, zero-knowledge proofs or ring signatures. These are high cryptography and high science that zero knowledge you can learn intuitively just from the name. A zero-knowledge proof proves one thing about a series of data. And the series of data is my transaction history. A zero-knowledge proof, I take all my data, I own it, because it's on my device, it's not on the blockchain yet. But I want to prove on the blockchain something about all my transactional data. I want to prove that I haven't counterfeited any money within all of the transactions I've sent to other people. The zero-knowledge proof looks at all the data on my device of the payments I've made, packages it up into a mathematical proof that anybody can independently verify. That only proves one thing. I didn't send any counterfeit transactions. I sent a bunch of transactions. You don't know anything about the rest of them, but I didn't counterfeit anyone. And everybody can see that. So it's a way of limiting what information we want to put publicly on a blockchain. And Zcash, as one particular technology here, provides granular control. This is on the roadmap, and actually it's already in the current distribution of the software, where if I wanted to selectively reveal more details about my transaction before that, beyond that simple proof of non-counterfeiting, I could. I could share basically a view key with somebody else to see more details. And maybe I'm sharing it because I just want to show somebody that I'm the anonymous donor of the foundation. You know, like, oh, I'm anonymous, but here, it's actually me. Yeah. Or maybe I'm sharing that view key because I am under subpoena, or there's a warrant, and that data needs to be collected from me. So this granular control is exactly what we would want. We don't want everything public on a blockchain. We also don't want everything necessarily private, or the inability to make things public when we want to or when we're compelled to. And the last thing I'll say about these things getting a bad rap, a lot of people don't realize this isn't, again, just crazy internet money. This is mainstream financial institutions that are really interested in this stuff. So when JP Morgan was developing its quorum protocol, which is their sort of dipping their toe in the water in a very serious way with respect to blockchain technology, they worked with the Zcash company developers, actually, to integrate these zero-knowledge proofs into their software stack. Because JP Morgan cares about privacy too, maybe for different reasons. They don't want to reveal their proprietary trading strategies to their counterparties like Goldman Sachs whenever they choose to use a blockchain to settle payments. So you need to have this sort of limited proving of things. This is a real trade from JP Morgan. We're also providing some additional information about the trade because maybe we're compelled to by regulators, and this is a zero-knowledge proof that provides that information or provides verification of that information, but we're not revealing everything about the trade on the blockchain.
Got it. So you mentioned, the transparency, the fact that you can show that this wasn't counterfeit. So it does sound, at least because I do some AML BSA work and KYC and all of that, that could actually help folks actually know who's doing the transaction. So what type of protections are there already in place, and kind of is that a potential benefit going forward? Yeah. So this is another myth that we, in our 4 years of operating CoinCenter, have frequently had to dispel, is this idea that Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies or token networks are unregulated. They are regulated. They're some of the most regulated innovations you could imagine because they are FinTech, and FinTech is a heavily regulated sector. So the Bank Secrecy Act and AML regulations are one area where you see regulation. And here you see FinCEN coming out in 2013 and issuing guidance and saying that if you're an administrator of one of these digital currency schemes, although that's more centralized digital currency, not these open blockchain networks, or if you're an exchanger, so you run a business holding people's virtual currency for them or making markets in them, so these are companies like Coinbase and Zappo and Gemini and the like, then you're a money services business. You need to register, submit suspicious activity reports, file so the SARs, do all the know your customer and record keeping and reporting requirements. Rather similar to a regular bank. There's subtly different requirements for money services businesses than banks, but we don't need to go into them.
So that's one area where we really do have regulation. And by and large, we've seen all the major exchanges comply with those regulations. There are, of course, rogue exchanges that are based usually in strange corners of the world that are not providing that information to anti-money laundering authorities, but I think their days are, frankly, numbered. We saw the BTCE enforcement action where FinCEN went after an Eastern European-based rogue exchange and actually indicted and captured the guy when he was visiting Greece. Alexander Vinnik is his name. So they are regulated for anti-money laundering purposes, and it's at these on-ramps and off-ramps where people decide to buy or sell Bitcoin or Ether or what have you that you really can have that anti-money laundering control in place because there's still an institution there. So these things are the square, not the tower, but there's always still some towers within the square. They're just fewer and smaller
towers.
and different, I guess.
Houses, yeah.
So there's still a pressure point for regulation there. And then the other areas that are regulated, these things are regulated to some extent for consumer protection because in many states their business will be treated as money transmission, which money transmission regulations at the state level never contemplated these businesses. They contemplated just your Western Union, and for a brief period of time, you hold some money on behalf of a customer because you're holding it until they use the money order to pay their utility provider. So there's a consumer protection problem there, like you could go out of business in that brief time and lose the customer's money. So there's some solvency and minimum capitalization requirements, though nothing like what banks have. And there's other things like disclosures to consumers. Maybe many of you are familiar with money transmission licensing at the state level, so I don't need to go over this. The thing is, these companies like Coinbase and Zap, they're much bigger than in the velocity of their business, the amount of money they secure, I think, than even some of the legacy money transmission players. And they have different risks. They might engender fewer risks in certain cases because they have excellent cybersecurity because they're dealing with things like crypto assets, which are hard to secure, and so they become expert at it. And these US regulated exchanges are not the ones that you see the headlines of them getting hacked. It's usually the rogue exchanges, the ones overseas where there aren't regulations. But they're also different because they become trading platforms. And trading platforms, kind of like securities exchanges, because there's a lot of retail investor interest and the assets change price with great speed, and there's a potential for market manipulation. And we can get into securities regulation, which is the third area of investor protection regulation, AML, consumer protection, investor regulation, the third area where these things are already regulated. And the SEC started formulating this policy about which tokens look like securities and which do not. And I think they're doing an excellent job, actually.
Yep.
And we can get into that maybe at some other point because I've really eaten up the time.
That's fine.
But suffice it to say, if there are some cryptocurrencies that are not securities, then they are by default commodities from a financial regulatory standpoint. And that means the CFTC would have some jurisdiction here, although the CFTC, of course, only regulates the derivative contracts like swaps and futures and things that are built on top of commodities markets. They don't go in and actually regulate the marketplace where people are buying and selling corn in person, the spot markets. And so what's interesting about cryptocurrency, if it's a cryptocurrency that's not a security, like I would argue, and the SEC has generally shown a similar viewpoint, Bitcoin or Ethereum, because they're decentralized, and we can get into that later, then the exchanges aren't regulated as securities exchanges because those aren't securities, and they are basically commodities spot markets, so they're not regulated directly by the CFTC, although they have authority for fraud and market manipulation. If they find evidence of it, they can police that, but they don't have a supervisory role. And yet, it seems like they should maybe have some sort of supervisory regulator, some sort of prudential regulator beyond just the state consumer protection regulator who's regulating for something like money transmission custody risk instead of...
Just slightly different than what we're talking about.
Very different. And there's a good moment here. We've talked all day about how there's this strange patchwork of regulation here in the US, 53 states and territories for money transmission licensing, 7, I was going to maybe disagree, maybe it's more like 8, 9 federal regulators who all potentially have something going on here. So this is a great area where the current regime is not ideal because it doesn't protect consumers from the right things. And it's also not ideal for the companies because it's this 53-state patchwork and a lot of legal uncertainty. Like, it's hard to get a money transmission license in every state if you're identical to Western Union and want to compete. It's really hard if you're not identical at all. You're something very new, and you have to explain that to every state regulator. So it would be, this is a big ask, but it is one of Coin Center's asks. Let's preempt state money transmission licensing with respect to these new open blockchain companies, which I think are going to fundamentally change the economy for the better and bring American jobs. Let's preempt state money transmission license and build a sensible federal prudential regulatory regime. A single regulator who's a point person for this. Now, how exactly that could happen and what are the options? We've written a paper on this, but we're just beginning to think about it.
Well, I know that we're definitely on the same page, and from a kind of American competitiveness standpoint, as we mentioned, time and again over these past couple hours, the fact that, in the UK you go to the Financial Conduct Authority, Singapore you have one regulator, so, I think that's why companies are so confused. So I do have a lot more questions for him, but that's why he's such a wealth of knowledge and just wanted to let him talk. But in the interest of time, just wanted to open it up to see if anybody has questions for Peter. Yes.
There are various attributes, right? One of which is that it's legal tender, right? So what I want to ask is, I kind of understand, and I think you've done a fantastic job of describing some of the underlying technologies and the benefits. But can you speak to sort of the value of cryptocurrency? When I go to cocktail parties and so forth, people just think Bitcoin or Ethereum. It's a Ponzi scheme because its value is solely what someone might pay for the thing on some wacko exchange. And so could you maybe speak to what the current thinking is about cryptocurrencies and it being a store of value, it being a medium of exchange, and how to address the volatility in the asset values that's feeding the misperceptions that these things are very speculative in some dark, sector?
So they're certainly speculative, but this idea that they've got nothing behind them, I think, is a fallacy. So just to take Bitcoin, because it's the original and the simplest and still the largest. Bitcoin's got certain things going for it. It is a digital bearer asset, which means it's capable of being transferred from person to person, and it's capable of being owned and held and fully controlled by a person without any other institution verifying that or backing it up or having to trust anyone else. So it's a digital bearer instrument. There's only so many of them. The software and the protocol and the blockchain, and you'll have to take my word for it in a short explanation, authenticate and verify in a way that's completely trustworthy, I think, that there are only ever going to be 21 million units of these bearer instruments. They're divisible to be smaller, but there's only ever going to be 21 million in total. So its supply is capped. You take those things together, and the fact that it's trivially easy to send a transaction across the world where you transfer it from one person to another in roughly an hour for enough confirmations to trust the transaction, and with very little fees in between. So you take those three things together, and what does it look like? It looks like gold, scarce commodity. Lots of people latch on to that scarcity. They believe that it's going to last as a scarce item, and so it could be a good store of value. You take those three, it's gold with a teleporter. So it's something where we know how much of it there is in the world. God isn't making any more of it. It's going to be really expensive to dig more out of the ground, and it becomes this store of value. Now, gold goes through bubbles, but I don't think there's anybody who wouldn't think that as part of a diversified portfolio, it might be a decent store of value, maybe an uncorrelated asset to other financial investments. So that, I think, is what Bitcoin has going for it. And from a non-financial answer, from a technical answer, what it's got going for it is it's the most conservative of all of these projects. So these projects are developed as open source software, like Linux. They're developed by massive communities of people who have to come together in an awkward process to decide how to fix a bug discovered in the software, how to add new features to the software. And the Bitcoin roadmap is very conservative, because there's this feeling that it does what it's supposed to do right now. It's just digital gold. And if that's all it ever does, that's all it needs to succeed. Contrast that with projects like Ethereum, where you could build that, say, smart mortgage token, a smart contract. A much more ambitious technology, but maybe also riskier from an investment standpoint.
All right, and I think we have run out our time, so thank you all very much for coming, and just a plug for our August 1st blockchain event. Hope to see you all here.
Thank you for having me.
Good morning. I will be very, very brief to ensure that you get out of here as quickly as possible. But thank you for joining us today. I think it was an excellent program. I want to have a special thanks to all of the participants who joined us today. I also want to especially thank the CCMC, the Capital Markets team, Tom Quadman, Kate, obviously, Ashley Eisner, and on the CTech team, Julie Stitzel and Stacy Hutchinson for your outstanding efforts to make today a success. And obviously, David Hirschman, who leads both of our groups. Thank you for your leadership as well. If you're not familiar with CTech, CTech is the technology hub of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And every day we work at the intersection of tech, business, government, and the consumer. We advocate for smart policy solutions that spur innovation and create jobs across the public and private sectors. We convene innovators. We build coalitions to tackle policy challenges of today and the future, and we tell the story, quite frankly, of how technology is impacting every sector of our economy. And by engaging Congress and the administration on emerging technology issues, we amplify technology's voice in the business community. The CTech team is lucky because, quite frankly, we get to work with almost every division in the building, in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and that includes, obviously, the Capital Markets team and their thoughtful work on the evolving landscape on FinTech. And one of the key points I hope that you will leave today with is that there are many layers and there's a lot of complexities around this issue of FinTech. And I think it's important that we have a clear understanding of the emerging technology and make sure that the folks that are regulating this technology have a clear understanding of what the benefits are and help to have a more thoughtful approach to the legislative and regulatory issues around it. If you are interested in continuing the FinTech conversation, I hope you will join us. The cards on the table for the blockchain event August 1st will be back here at the Chamber. We have an incredible lineup of speakers, and hopefully you'll be able to be back for that event. The program will have a session dedicated to FinTech, but we are also highlighting the use of blockchain across all industries as well. And that really gets, I think, at the heart of the benefit of the Chamber and the breadth of our membership and the issues that we are engaged in. Our goal with the blockchain event is that the people walk away with a better understanding of emerging technology and that its practical applications across all industries as well. You know, this year, it's amazing, the Chamber is 106 years old, and while technology has changed drastically over those many years, what has attracted businesses to the Chamber, quite frankly, has not. And so technology will continue to be a major driver of stronger, sustained growth, and if we leverage it smartly and carefully, I think we will all benefit. When you think of technology, I hope you will think of CTech and what we are doing at the Chamber. And if you have questions about our work, please do not hesitate to contact me. I look forward to continuing today's conversation and working on the issues and making sure that we get our FinTech principles to the Hill and continue the conversation with the Capital Markets Group and with you as well. So thank you again and enjoy your day. Thank you.
Give me a second, I
get my story straight. My friends are in the bathroom getting higher than the Empire State. My lover, she is waiting for me just across the bar. My seat's been taken by some sunglasses, asking about a scar. And I know I gave it to you months ago. I know you're trying to forget, but between the drinks and subtle things, the holes in my apologies, you know, I'm trying hard to take it back. So if by the time the bar closes and you feel like falling down, I'll carry you home tonight. We are young, so let's set the world on fire. We can burn brighter than the sun tonight. We are young, so let's set the world on fire. We can burn brighter than the sun. Now I know that I'm not